Good evening. If you haven't yet witnessed part one of our chronicle, I suggest clicking the link below. What follows is the conclusion of our American tragedy. The broadcasts you will hear have been created using artificial intelligence. The voices are synthetic, but the narrative, the structure, the warning they contain, these were directed by human hands. Technology provides the vessel, but human imagination charts the course. These broadcasts remain fictional creations. Any resemblance to actual events, actual politicians, actual moments of division in our present day is coincidental. And yet, the mechanisms of division portrayed here already operate within our information ecosystem. The broadcast will begin momentarily. I'll be waiting for you at the conclusion. Enjoy the show.
Submitted for your consideration. A nation once united, now fractured along fault lines of ideology and geography. What began with the assassination of Barrett Strife, podcaster, cultural bridge builder, voice of reason in a time of unreason, has escalated beyond mere division into armed conflict on American soil. You've witnessed the first tremors of this calamity. A public execution broadcasted live to millions. Grieving masses gathering in candlelight vigils that turned to blood-soaked riots. Governors declaring independence while presidents invoked emergency powers. The first shots of a new civil war echoing across the heartland. But what you've seen thus far is merely prologue. You're about to cross a boundary into the main act of this American tragedy. A landscape where yesterday's unthinkable becomes today's reality. Where urban centers become besieged fortresses. Where ordinary citizens must choose between conflicting loyalties or create entirely new ones. Where the institutions designed to bind us together become weapons to drive us apart. You may recognize the landmarks in this broken terrain. Chicago, Washington, the rural townships and suburban neighborhoods that once formed a unified nation. But the rules governing this territory have changed. Information itself has become ammunition. Truth competes with tactical advantage. And beneath the surface conflict lies a pattern too terrible for most to comprehend. You're about to witness the final chapters of an American dissolution told through failing broadcasts, emergency bulletins, and the desperate voices of those caught between warring factions. A journey through collapsed infrastructure, contested cities, and the systematic dismantling of everything once taken for granted. A chronicle of how civilized society unravels not in a sudden catastrophe, but through the gradual normalization of the unthinkable. This is the path through part 2 of the Second Republic. A guided tour through the consequences of division, the price of hatred, and perhaps, if one looks closely enough, the first fragile seeds of eventual reconciliation. A reminder that even in our darkest hour, human connection persists despite every system designed to sever it. Consider this your final orientation before full immersion. From infrastructure collapse to refugee crises, from battlefield hospitals to corporate boardrooms where the true architects of chaos calculate their profits, you're about to witness America's darkest chapter unfold in real time. The boundary between observer and participant has now dissolved. You are no longer merely audience, but witness to history's most terrible rehearsal, a dress rehearsal for a future that awaits us all, if we fail to recognize our shared humanity beyond manufactured division. Welcome to the Second Republic, Part 2, where the true cost of conflict is measured not in territories gained or constitutional principles defended, but in the sacrifice of everything that once made America whole.
Broadcasting from a mobile unit on the outskirts of St. Louis. This marks our third location in as many days as we attempt to maintain reliable transmission amid increasingly fragmented communication networks. 3 weeks have passed since the formal declaration of secession by the Interior States Coalition and President Loomis's invocation of the Insurrection Act. The human toll of this conflict has already reached staggering proportions. Military casualties are estimated at over 2,000 dead and 7,500 wounded across both federal and coalition forces. Civilian deaths have surpassed 4,300, with tens of thousands injured and over 1 million displaced from their homes. What began as political confrontation has evolved into the deadliest American military engagement since Vietnam. The Battle of Springfield 2 days ago marked the conflict's bloodiest engagement to date. Federal forces attempting to secure a strategic transportation hub were met with coordinated coalition defense that military analysts describe as unexpectedly sophisticated. When federal air support was deployed, coalition forces utilized previously undisclosed anti-aircraft capabilities, downing 3 F-15s and forcing a tactical withdrawal of federal air assets. The resulting ground engagement lasted 14 hours, leaving the city's downtown in ruins and critical infrastructure, hospitals, power stations, water treatment facilities severely damaged or destroyed. Federal forces ultimately secured nominal control of the transportation nexus, but at a cost military observers describe as unsustainable if replicated across multiple engagements. Infrastructure damage extends far beyond combat zones, creating cascading humanitarian crises in regions not directly affected by military operations. Power generation capacity across the Midwest has decreased by approximately 60% due to targeted strikes and cyber attacks. Water systems in 17 major metropolitan areas operate at reduced capacity or have failed entirely. Medical facilities report critical shortages of essential supplies, with emergency rooms performing triage procedures by flashlight in many affected regions. The economic impact already exceeds $300 billion in direct damage, with cascading effects potentially reaching into the trillions as supply chains collapse and markets respond to unprecedented internal conflict. We go now to Tifa Lockhart, who is monitoring the largest civilian evacuation since Hurricane Katrina. Tifa, what's the situation on the ground?
John, I'm positioned along Interstate 70 just east of Columbia, Missouri, where federal airstrikes against coalition military installations have triggered a mass exodus of civilians from urban centers throughout the region. What you're seeing behind me is just one segment of a convoy stretching nearly 40 miles, families who've abandoned their homes with whatever possessions they could carry, attempting to reach either federal Union territory to the east or Central Alliance safe zones to the west. The humanitarian situation is deteriorating rapidly. These evacuees have been on the road for up to 3 days, facing fuel shortages, limited access to food and water, and temperatures approaching 95 degrees. Most concerning are reports of checkpoint conflicts where evacuees are caught between federal and coalition forces, each claiming jurisdiction over key transit routes.
What's the official response from both federal and coalition authorities regarding these civilian evacuations?
The disconnect between official statements and ground reality could not be more stark, John. Federal authorities have designated what they call humanitarian corridors, allegedly protected by air cover and advanced security teams. However, these corridors exist primarily on Pentagon maps rather than on actual roadways. The routes change hourly as skirmishes erupt, and many evacuees report receiving contradictory guidance from different federal units. Coalition forces, meanwhile, are actively discouraging evacuation, characterizing the exodus as unnecessary panic, and claiming that federal forces are deliberately creating a refugee crisis to destabilize interior regions. At several checkpoints, coalition personnel are attempting to redirect civilians back to their homes or to designated shelter areas under coalition control. The result is mass confusion, with families making life or death decisions based on fragmented, often contradictory information. I spoke with Maria Reyes, a hospital administrator who fled Kansas City with her 3 children after federal airstrikes hit within a mile of their home.
We left with whatever we could fit in the car. The federal emergency alert said to take Interstate 70 east towards St. Louis, but when we got to the checkpoint near Boonville, state police told us federal forces were targeting that exact route. We've changed direction 3 times in 2 days. My kids are sleeping in the car. We haven't showered in 4 days. And nobody, not federal, not state, seems to know what's happening 10 miles down the road.
We're now going to Lisa Fremont, who's coordinating humanitarian response from the Central Alliance headquarters in Denver. Lisa, how is the Alliance addressing this growing refugee crisis?
The Central Alliance has established emergency reception centers along all major highways entering our territory, John. These facilities are providing immediate medical care, temporary housing, and family reunification services. We've processed over 80,000 displaced persons in the past week alone, with projections suggesting that number could triple by month's end if current trends continue. Our greatest challenge is maintaining neutrality while addressing immediate human needs. Both federal and coalition authorities have accused us of harboring sympathizers from the opposing side, and we've received formal warnings from both governments regarding our refugee policies. Our position remains firm. Humanitarian assistance is provided without political conditions or screening. We don't ask evacuees which authority they recognize. We ask what medical attention they require and how many family members need shelter.
There are reports that some evacuation routes have come under direct military fire. Can you confirm these incidents?
We've documented at least 7 instances where civilian evacuation convoys have been caught in crossfire between federal and coalition forces. The most serious occurred yesterday near Jefferson City, where an artillery exchange struck a line of vehicles attempting to cross the Missouri River. Our medical teams treated dozens of civilian casualties, including 18 children. Both sides deny deliberately targeting civilians and blame the other for positioning military assets near evacuation routes. What's clear from our documentation is that neither side is adequately accounting for civilian movement in their military operations. The supposedly secure corridors announced by federal authorities frequently pass directly through areas of active combat. Meanwhile, coalition forces are establishing checkpoints on routes that they previously designated as civilian evacuation zones.
Let's hear the official perspective from both sides. Thomas Doyle represents the federal position. Major Doyle, how does the federal government respond to allegations that its military operations are endangering civilian evacuees?
The Federal Union has established the most comprehensive civilian protection protocols in the history of internal conflict. Our humanitarian corridors are designated based on real-time intelligence, with air cover and advanced security teams to ensure safe passage. Any civilian casualties are the direct result of coalition forces deliberately positioning military assets in or near population centers, a clear violation of established conflict protocols. I want to emphasize that the evacuation itself has been necessitated by coalition actions. By rejecting constitutional authority and initiating armed conflict, insurrectionist leaders have knowingly placed their own citizens at risk. The federal government is expending extraordinary resources to mitigate a humanitarian crisis that would not exist absent the illegal secession and subsequent military actions by coalition forces.
And from the coalition perspective, we're joined by Roger Thornhill. Mr. Thornhill, how do coalition authorities view the ongoing civilian evacuation?
This is not an evacuation. It's a forced displacement orchestrated by federal authorities to depopulate coalition territories. Federal airstrikes have deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, including power stations, water treatment facilities, and communications networks, creating conditions that make normal life impossible. This is a calculated strategy to undermine coalition governance by generating a refugee crisis. Coalition authorities have established secure shelter zones within our territories, where citizens can receive protection, food, water, and medical care without undertaking dangerous journeys across active combat zones. We're also documenting numerous cases of federal checkpoints preventing coalition citizens from traveling west to neutral territories, instead forcing them eastward into federal zones, a clear violation of freedom of movement.
Amid these competing claims, a troubling pattern is emerging regarding who benefits from the humanitarian crisis. Marion Crane, independent journalist, has been investigating the economic dimensions of the evacuation. Marion, what have you uncovered?
Following the money reveals a disturbing reality beneath the political rhetoric, John. Federal emergency management contracts for evacuation support services were awarded to Shinra Group subsidiaries 3 days before the first federal airstrikes that triggered the mass exodus. These no-bid contracts, valued at over $1.2 billion, cover everything from transportation to temporary housing to security services at refugee processing centers. Equally concerning, the same corporate conglomerate has secured contracts with coalition authorities for civilian protection infrastructure in their secure shelter zones. The identical corporate entities are profiting from both the displacement and the containment of civilian populations. Their stock value has increased by 28% since the evacuation began, with private investors acquiring significant new positions just hours before the first airstrikes.
As the evacuation continues, we're receiving reports of an incident that embodies both the tragedy of this conflict and the resilience of human compassion. Alexander Sebastian, Chancellor of the Central Alliance, can you tell us about the situation at Checkpoint 37?
Checkpoint 37 is located on Highway 36 near the Missouri-Illinois border, one of the most heavily trafficked evacuation routes. Yesterday afternoon, a coalition fuel transport attempting to resupply stranded civilian vehicles was intercepted by federal forces who suspected it of military intent. During the resulting standoff, a busload of evacuees, including numerous children and elderly, became stranded between the opposing forces, running out of fuel and water in 94-degree heat. What happened next offers a rare moment of hope. A Federal Union medic and a coalition mechanic independently approached the bus under white flags. Together, they repaired the bus's engine, provided water to the passengers, and then jointly approached both military units to negotiate a temporary ceasefire zone around the evacuation route. For 6 hours, these two individuals, supposedly enemies, coordinated the safe passage of over 300 civilians while their respective forces maintained positions.
As darkness falls on this third week of America's internal conflict, the humanitarian crisis continues to deepen. Federal airstrikes expand across coalition territory. Coalition forces establish new checkpoints controlling civilian movement. The Central Alliance struggles to accommodate growing refugee populations. And throughout it all, ordinary Americans demonstrate that the human capacity for compassion often transcends the artificial boundaries of political allegiance. From a mobile transmission unit on the periphery of divided America, this is John Connor, reporting on a nation where the battle lines are drawn not merely on maps, but through neighborhoods, communities, and families.
This is an emergency broadcast from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This is not a test. The following message is transmitted at the request of the Department of Homeland Security and applies to all citizens in Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and southern Illinois. Due to ongoing military operations against insurrectionist forces, a mandatory evacuation order is now in effect for the following areas: all counties within a 50-mile radius of Kansas City, St. Louis, Springfield, Little Rock, Tulsa, and Oklahoma City. Residents in these areas must evacuate immediately. Federal humanitarian corridors have been established on the following routes: Interstate 70 eastbound from Kansas City to St. Louis, Interstate 44 eastbound from Springfield to St. Louis, Interstate 40 eastbound from Oklahoma City to Memphis, Interstate 30 eastbound from Little Rock to Memphis. These corridors are secured by federal forces and offer the safest evacuation path for civilians. All evacuees should proceed to federal emergency relocation centers, established in the following locations: East St. Louis, Illinois; Cairo, Illinois; Evansville, Indiana; Memphis, Tennessee. These facilities provide temporary shelter, medical care, and family reunification services. Do not attempt to use state highways or secondary roads for evacuation. These routes may be subject to insurrectionist checkpoints or active combat operations. Federal protection cannot be guaranteed on non-designated evacuation routes. For your safety, comply with all instructions from federal personnel at checkpoints. Have identification documents ready for processing. Evacuation priority is given to families with children, the elderly, and those requiring medical attention. Pack only essential items: medications, important documents, 3 days of clothing, and non-perishable food. Evacuees are limited to 1 vehicle per household and 1 personal bag per individual. Federal resources are positioned to assist those without transportation. Warning: insurrectionist forces are disseminating false information regarding federal evacuation protocols. Disregard any evacuation instructions not originating from official federal emergency channels. Coalition-controlled media and emergency broadcasts contain deliberately misleading information designed to prevent civilians from reaching federal protection.
This is an emergency alert from the Interior States Coalition Emergency Management Authority. Federal forces are conducting airstrikes against civilian infrastructure. The so-called humanitarian corridors established by federal authorities are being targeted for military operations. Do not attempt to use federal evacuation routes. Coalition civilian protection zones have been established in the following locations: Columbia, Jefferson City, Rolla, Fayetteville, Stillwater, and Muskogee. These locations offer secure shelter, medical services, and essential supplies away from federal strike zones. If evacuation is absolutely necessary, proceed to the nearest coalition checkpoint for escort to designated safe zones. Do not attempt to cross state lines without coalition authorization, as federal forces are detaining coalition citizens for interrogation at border crossings.
Federal authorities have detected an unauthorized broadcast interruption. This constitutes illegal interference with emergency communications during a national crisis. Disregard all non-federal emergency broadcasts, which contain deliberately false information. Evacuation update. Due to insurrectionist activity, Interstate 70 between Columbia and Kingdom City is temporarily closed. Evacuees should divert to Highway 54 southbound to Jefferson City, then proceed eastbound on Highway 50. Federal escorts are positioned at major intersections to direct evacuation traffic.
This is an emergency notification from the Central Alliance Humanitarian Coordination Center. For those seeking neutral territory, the Central Alliance has established reception points at the following locations: Western Missouri border, Humanitarian Zone Alpha, junction of Highways 36 and 65, Humanitarian Zone Bravo, junction of Highways 54 and 65, Humanitarian Zone Charlie, junction of Highways 60 and 65, Eastern Kansas border, Humanitarian Zone Delta, junction of Highways 36 and 81, Humanitarian Zone Echo, junction of Interstate 70 and Highway 81, Humanitarian Zone Foxtrot, junction of Highways 54 and 81. Central Alliance reception centers accept all displaced persons regardless of political affiliation or territory of origin. No identification is required for entry into Central Alliance humanitarian zones. Medical care and emergency shelter are provided without political conditions.
This broadcast has been compromised by unauthorized transmissions. Federal authorities are working to restore secure emergency communications. Remember, the only authorized evacuation instructions come from FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security. Disregard all other sources. For your safety and protection, report to the nearest federal evacuation checkpoint immediately. This is not a test. This is an emergency broadcast from the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
This is Late Night America on frequency 104.7. I'm Vincent Valentine. 3 weeks into this conflict, the Battle of Springfield has left the city in ruins and changed everything. Tonight, we're hearing from people experiencing the war firsthand. How is this affecting regular Americans caught in the middle? Our line is open at 555 9 a.m. Rachel from Missouri, you're on.
I was a nurse at Mercy Hospital until 3 days ago when federal forces took it over for military casualties. We had over 200 patients who had to evacuate with barely 4 hours notice. I'm working from a high school gym now with whatever supplies we can find. What nobody's talking about is how the evacuation routes keep changing hourly. People are stuck choosing between staying in a war zone or risking roads that might be under attack by the time they get there. We've treated dozens of families who were injured following official evacuation instructions that led them straight into firefights.
Derek from Illinois, you're on Late Night America.
I was with the 10th Mountain Division during Springfield. What people need to understand is how different urban combat is from what either side shows in their broadcasts. It's not surgical strikes or heroic resistance, it's absolute chaos. The worst part was clearing buildings when we didn't know if civilians were inside. We'd breach a door expecting fighters and find terrified families. Other times, we'd approach carefully thinking civilians were present and take fire from prepared positions. In one apartment building, we found fighters using the top floors while civilians were still in the basement. Neither knew the others were there. I helped with rescue after the hospital was hit. The medical staff didn't care which side you were on. There was a coalition medic working next to a federal doctor, both just trying to save whoever they could pull from the rubble. I watched a nurse who'd been working for 30 straight hours running triage outside while the building was still burning. Those medical personnel are the only heroes in this mess.
Jessica from Kansas, you're on Late Night America.
I'm with medical services operating from converted schools near the Missouri border. We're seeing injuries our civilian medical system was never designed to handle: fragmentation wounds, blast trauma, and massive internal injuries. Our surgeons are adapting techniques from videos shared by Middle Eastern doctors who've dealt with these wounds for years. We've got dermatologists doing vascular surgery and pediatricians handling trauma because we're desperately short-staffed. What happens after battles is almost worse than the fighting. Springfield's water treatment plant was damaged, not deliberately targeted, just caught in crossfire. Now we're seeing the first cases of waterborne illness. The 6-year-old I treated last night wasn't hit by bullets, but by window glass when a blast wave tore through her neighborhood half a block from a strike. The most distressing cases come from small towns where a patrol and militia exchange fire for 20 minutes, then both leave. But they've left behind wounded civilians and damaged water lines in places with no medical facilities for 50 miles. Those are the forgotten casualties of this war.
Sophia from Indiana, you're on Late Night America.
I'm calling from what they're calling the gray zone, contested territory that's changed hands 3 times in 2 weeks. I work with a volunteer group maintaining basic services where neither side has stayed to establish order. When conventional authority collapses, something always fills the vacuum. In some communities, it's neighborhood councils organizing food distribution and security patrols. In others, it's church networks coordinating medical care and shelter. But in some places, it's armed groups with no connection to either side who've moved in to exploit the chaos. Riverdale, 20 miles from me, shows how quickly things evolve. Federal forces held it briefly, then coalition took control for 3 days. After they moved on, a group calling themselves the Riverdale Protection Committee stepped in. They started as legitimate community self-defense, but within days were demanding payment for security and controlling who gets access to remaining supplies. The most hopeful example is New Madison, where former federal and coalition supporters work together on a town council that's kept basic services running. They've organized around practical needs rather than politics. Their emergency broadcast starts with, "We are not federal, we are not coalition, we are neighbors." That's the model that might actually survive, people recognizing their shared needs beyond the artificial divisions.
As we hear these stories from the front lines, medical facilities, and contested zones, we see how this conflict affects ordinary Americans caught in the middle. While official broadcasts focus on territory and victories, the fundamental systems that make society function are breaking down. Water, power, transportation, communications, the invisible infrastructure of modern life is collapsing under the strain. Yet amid this breakdown, we're witnessing remarkable human resilience. Medical personnel treating casualties regardless of affiliation, communities developing governance systems when official structures fail, neighbors recognizing shared needs despite political differences. This is Vincent Valentine reminding you that in times when systems fail, human connection becomes our most essential resource. Good night, America.
Broadcasting from a secured location within Central Alliance territory. 6 weeks have passed since the formal declaration of secession, and what many military analysts predicted would be a swift federal restoration of control has instead evolved into an entrenched guerrilla conflict across multiple fronts. Conventional warfare doctrine has given way to asymmetric tactics as interior coalition forces adapt to the technological superiority of federal military assets. We go now to Tifa Lockhart, who has been embedded with a federal mobile response unit near the Missouri-Illinois border. Tifa, what are you witnessing on the front lines?
John, I'm positioned with the 82nd Airborne's Forward Reconnaissance Team approximately 30 miles west of St. Louis in what was, until recently, considered secure federal territory. The nature of this conflict defies traditional military reporting because there are no fixed battle lines, no clear fronts, and often no visible enemy until the moment of engagement. What federal forces describe as pacified zones can transform into active combat areas within minutes. Just this morning, a federal convoy traveling along Highway 40 was ambushed by what appeared to be ordinary farm equipment positioned in adjacent fields, combines, and tractors retrofitted with improvised weapon systems that emerged from concealment, executed a coordinated strike, and then dispersed before air support could respond. The psychological impact on federal forces is substantial. These troops were trained for conventional warfare against nation-state adversaries, not an enemy that blends into the civilian population and utilizes intimate knowledge of local terrain. As one lieutenant told me, we control the air and the major roads during daylight hours. They control everything else.
This shift to guerrilla tactics represents a significant evolution in coalition strategy. Let's hear from Thomas Doyle, Federal Military Liaison, for the official assessment of the current military situation.
What we're witnessing is the desperate adaptation of an outmatched insurrectionist force. Federal military superiority in conventional terms is unquestioned. We maintain absolute air dominance, superior artillery capability, and technological advantages across all major weapon systems. Coalition forces have been forced to adopt guerrilla tactics precisely because they cannot engage federal forces directly and expect to prevail. I want to emphasize that these insurgent tactics carry a severe cost for the civilian population in contested areas. By embedding their forces within civilian infrastructure, disguising combatants as non-combatants, and utilizing civilian buildings for military purposes, coalition leadership is deliberately placing its own citizens at risk. These tactics violate established protocols of internal conflict and demonstrate a callous disregard for civilian welfare. Federal forces are adapting rapidly to these asymmetric challenges. Our counterinsurgency protocols draw on 2 decades of experience in similar environments abroad. We're implementing advanced identification systems to distinguish combatants from civilians, deploying specialized units trained specifically for distributed battlefield operations, and utilizing drone surveillance networks to identify and neutralize insurgent activities before they threaten federal personnel or loyal civilian populations.
For perspective from the coalition side, we turn to Roger Thornhill, who represents the Interior States coalition position. Mr. Thornhill, how does the coalition characterize the current military situation?
The coalition is engaged in a legitimate defense of sovereign territory against an invading force using disproportionate and indiscriminate violence against our citizens. When federal forces deploy supersonic aircraft against civilian infrastructure, launch cruise missiles into populated areas, and utilize battlefield weapons in urban environments, they leave us no choice but to adopt defensive tactics that leverage our primary advantage, intimate knowledge of our own communities and landscapes. What federal authorities dismissively call guerrilla tactics are in fact the time-honored strategies of homeland defense employed throughout history by populations resisting occupation. Our forces operate with the express consent and support of local communities. The civilian infrastructure Major Doyle references isn't being exploited. It's being defended by its rightful owners and stakeholders. The family farm that harbors coalition defense units does so willingly because those units are comprised of neighbors and community members protecting their homes. I want to directly address the federal characterization of our tactics as desperate. The American Revolution was won by similar asymmetric approaches against a technologically superior British force. The Continental Army didn't attempt to match British naval power or artillery capacity. They leveraged terrain, local support, and mobility to exhaust an enemy fighting far from home. The coalition is applying these same principles against a federal force that similarly underestimates the resolve of a population defending its sovereignty.
Let's examine one of the most significant tactical developments, the targeting of transportation infrastructure. Tifa, what can you tell us about the rail network attacks that have become a hallmark of this conflict?
The disruption of rail networks has emerged as perhaps the most effective coalition strategy to date, John. In the past 2 weeks alone, coalition forces have executed over 40 coordinated strikes against rail infrastructure across Missouri, Arkansas, and eastern Oklahoma. These aren't crude sabotage operations. They're sophisticated, synchronized actions that demonstrate detailed knowledge of federal logistics and supply chains. I witnessed the aftermath of one such operation near Jefferson City, where coalition units simultaneously disabled 6 key rail junctions using shaped charges that specifically targeted switching mechanisms. The precision was remarkable. Civilian structures less than 50 yards from the targets remained untouched, while the critical infrastructure was rendered inoperable. Federal repair crews estimate it will take weeks to restore full functionality, during which time military supplies must be rerouted via road networks that are considerably more vulnerable to ambush. What makes these operations particularly effective is their distributed nature. Federal forces simply cannot protect thousands of miles of rail infrastructure against small, highly mobile teams executing coordinated strikes and then immediately dispersing into the surrounding communities. One federal commander described it as trying to guard every telephone pole along every highway simultaneously.
The other signature tactic in this evolving conflict involves unmanned aerial systems. Chris Redfield, our defense analyst, joins us to explain the drone warfare dimension of this conflict. Chris, how are both sides utilizing these technologies?
We're witnessing the first true drone versus drone conflict on American soil, John, with both federal and coalition forces deploying increasingly sophisticated unmanned systems. Federal forces maintain superiority in terms of high-altitude, long-endurance platforms, primarily modified Reaper and Global Hawk systems that provide persistent surveillance over coalition territory. These systems operate from secure bases well behind federal lines and are largely immune to coalition countermeasures. However, coalition forces have demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in the development and deployment of low-altitude tactical drones. They've repurposed commercial drone technology with encrypted control systems and improvised weapons capabilities, creating swarm attacks that have successfully neutralized federal armored vehicles and even brought down military helicopters. Most concerning from a federal perspective is the coalition's use of autonomous drones programmed to operate even when communications are jammed, essentially fire and forget weapon systems that can identify and engage targets without human intervention. The most significant development is the emergence of what military analysts call the drone screen, a defensive layer of coalition counter-drone systems that create airspace denial zones around key facilities and forces. These systems don't attempt to shoot down federal aircraft directly, but instead confuse their sensors, disrupt their communications links, or simply make it impossible to distinguish between real targets and decoys. The result is a contested airspace where federal technological superiority is partially neutralized by low-cost, distributed countermeasures.
We've received footage of a recent engagement near Springfield that illustrates the asymmetric nature of this conflict. Lisa Fremont has been documenting the humanitarian impact of these evolving tactics. Lisa, what can you tell us about the situation on the ground?
The human cost of these guerrilla tactics is devastating for civilian populations caught between the opposing forces, John. The Springfield operation mentioned involved a coalition drone strike against a federal command post established in a former high school. While militarily successful from the coalition perspective, the strike disabled federal communications and forced a temporary withdrawal. The operation triggered a disproportionate federal response, including artillery bombardment of suspected coalition positions in residential areas. Our humanitarian teams documented over 120 civilian casualties from this single engagement, many of them residents with no connection to either military force. The pattern is tragically consistent. Coalition forces execute precision strikes against federal targets. Federal forces respond with overwhelming but less discriminate firepower, and civilians bear the brunt of the escalation. Medical facilities in Springfield are overwhelmed, with basic supplies exhausted and surgical teams working continuously for days without rest.
What's particularly concerning is the deterioration of core infrastructure in contested zones. Water treatment facilities, power distribution systems, and food supply chains have been severely compromised, not necessarily through direct targeting, but as collateral damage from the ongoing conflict. We're documenting outbreaks of waterborne illness in communities that had modern sanitation systems just weeks ago. Without functional infrastructure, these communities face humanitarian crises that will persist long after any military resolution.
The conflict has also taken on a cultural dimension that reflects deeper American divisions. Tifa, you've reported on the symbolism adopted by both sides in this increasingly ideological struggle.
The visual and cultural languages of this conflict have evolved rapidly, John. Federal forces maintain standardized military insignia and equipment, emphasizing professionalism and institutional continuity. Their operational terminology references restoration of constitutional order and securing the homeland. Vehicle markings and uniforms prominently display the American flag in its traditional form, symbols of continuity with pre-conflict national identity. Coalition forces, by contrast, have developed a diverse visual language that emphasizes regional identity and revolutionary heritage. Many units display modified state flags or historical symbols like the pine tree flag from the American Revolution. Their equipment, often repurposed civilian vehicles and improvised weapon systems, bears hand-painted insignia and locally significant symbols. Their operational terminology explicitly references the Revolutionary War, units called Minutemen, operations named after revolutionary battles, communications signed with the names of founding fathers. What's particularly striking is how these cultural markers transcend military operations and permeate civilian communities. In coalition-controlled areas, modified flags fly from private homes, historical revolutionary symbols appear as graffiti, and radio broadcasts open with quotes from founding fathers about resistance to tyranny. The conflict has rapidly developed its own cultural mythology that frames current events within a narrative of historical continuity and righteous resistance.
There's another, more troubling pattern emerging regarding who benefits from this protracted guerrilla conflict. Marion Crane has been investigating the economic dimensions of the evolving military situation. Marion, what have you uncovered?
Following the money again reveals patterns that contradict the public positions of both federal and coalition authorities. John, while federal officials characterize coalition forces as desperate and outmatched, they've awarded over $8 billion in emergency contracts to private military contractors for counterinsurgency operations. These same contractors are simultaneously providing infrastructure security services to coalition authorities under different corporate entities, effectively profiting from both sides of the conflict. Particularly concerning is the pattern of investment in drone technology companies by the same financial entities that hold controlling interests in these military contractors. As the conflict shifts toward unmanned systems, these investors see returns regardless of which side holds tactical advantage in any given engagement. The more the conflict escalates in technological sophistication, the greater the profit for these corporate interests that supply both federal and coalition forces with increasingly advanced systems. I've also documented substantial investment in reconstruction and infrastructure companies by these same financial groups. The destruction of transportation networks, power systems, and urban infrastructure creates massive future demand for rebuilding services, services that will be provided by corporate entities already positioning themselves as essential partners in post-conflict recovery. The longer and more destructive the conflict, the more lucrative the eventual reconstruction contracts.
As night falls across a divided America, the military situation continues to evolve in ways that defy conventional analysis. Federal forces maintain technological superiority, but struggle to translate that advantage into territorial control. Coalition forces compensate for material disadvantages through asymmetric tactics and intimate knowledge of the battle space. Civilians in contested areas endure hardships unimaginable just weeks ago, and throughout it all, corporate interests position themselves to profit regardless of military outcomes. This is John Connor, reporting on a nation at war with itself.
The following broadcast was recorded in a Central Alliance secure facility. This independent production is not affiliated with either federal or coalition authorities and represents the personal views of the participants.
Welcome to Ground Truth, the podcast where we examine the human realities behind the headlines. I'm Marion Crane, independent journalist reporting from Denver, and today I'm joined by Lisa Fremont, humanitarian coordinator for the Central Alliance. Lisa, thank you for making time during what must be an overwhelming crisis.
Thank you for having me, Marion. I believe accurate information is as essential as medical supplies or clean water in this conflict. The competing narratives from both federal and coalition sources make it nearly impossible for civilians to make informed decisions about their safety.
Let's start with the humanitarian situation in contested zones. Your teams have unique access to areas where neither federal nor coalition authorities permit independent reporting. What are you witnessing that isn't being covered in official accounts?
The reality on the ground bears little resemblance to the sanitized briefings from either side, Marion. Both federal and coalition authorities characterize their operations as surgical and precision-targeted, but our medical teams are treating hundreds of civilian casualties daily, many with injuries consistent with indiscriminate weapons deployment. What's particularly disturbing is the targeting of what we call life support infrastructure, water treatment facilities, power distribution networks, food storage and transport systems. Whether through direct targeting or as collateral damage, the destruction of these systems creates humanitarian crises that persist long after any military engagement concludes. We're seeing communities where dysentery and cholera, diseases virtually unknown in pre-war America, are now spreading rapidly due to contaminated water supplies.
Both federal and coalition authorities claim to prioritize civilian protection in their operations. Do your observations support these claims?
There's a profound disconnect between rhetoric and reality. Federal forces establish what they call humanitarian corridors for civilian evacuation, but these corridors frequently pass through active combat zones, lack adequate security, and change routes with minimal notice. We've documented cases where evacuation buses following federally designated routes were caught in crossfire because military units weren't informed of civilian movement along those routes. Coalition forces, meanwhile, actively discourage civilian evacuation from areas under their control, characterizing it as unnecessary panic or federal manipulation. They establish checkpoints that prevent civilians from leaving contested zones, ostensibly for security screening, but effectively creating a captive population. Their insistence on embedding military assets within civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, community centers, directly increases the risk to non-combatants.
Your organization has documented potential violations of established conflict protocols. Can you elaborate on these findings?
We've compiled extensive evidence of concerning practices by both sides. Federal forces are employing weapon systems designed for conventional battlefield environments, including cluster munitions and thermobaric explosives in populated areas. These weapons, by their nature, cannot distinguish between combatants and civilians when deployed in urban settings. We've also documented cases of federal checkpoints refusing to allow wounded civilians to evacuate if they can't produce specific identification documents, a clear violation of medical neutrality principles. Coalition forces are removing identifying markers from their vehicles and personnel, blurring the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. They're also establishing what they call community defense units, where civilians, including minors, receive weapons training and engage in combat support activities. This practice effectively militarizes civilian populations and removes their protected status under conflict protocols.
There are rumors of detention facilities established by both sides for those suspected of supporting the opposition. Has your organization been able to verify these reports?
We've confirmed the existence of detention facilities operated by both federal and coalition authorities, Marion, though neither side officially acknowledges them. Federal facilities are primarily located in repurposed military bases in Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, while coalition facilities are concentrated in rural areas of Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Our attempts to access these facilities have been repeatedly denied, despite international protocols guaranteeing humanitarian organizations access to detention sites during internal conflicts. From interviews with released detainees, we've documented concerning patterns including detention without formal charges, interrogation techniques that likely constitute psychological torture, and denial of medical care for injuries sustained during arrest or detention. Most troubling is the near-total information blackout surrounding these facilities. Families have no official mechanism to determine if their relatives are detained, where they're being held, or on what grounds. We've established a cross-registration database that attempts to track detained individuals, but both federal and coalition authorities actively obstruct these efforts.
Let's discuss the children caught in this conflict. Your organization has made child welfare a priority in its humanitarian response. What are you seeing in terms of impact on the youngest Americans?
The situation for children is nothing short of catastrophic, Marion. Beyond the immediate physical dangers of combat, they're experiencing profound psychological trauma and developmental disruption. Schools in contested areas have been closed for weeks, either repurposed as military installations or evacuation centers, or simply too dangerous to reach. Critical childhood vaccination programs have collapsed, creating vulnerability to diseases we haven't seen in generations. We're particularly concerned about separated children, those who have become disconnected from their families during evacuation or combat operations. Our centers have registered over 6,000 unaccompanied minors since the conflict began. Some were separated during chaotic evacuations, others sent ahead with neighbors or distant relatives when parents stayed behind to protect property, and a heartbreaking number have been orphaned by the violence. Perhaps most concerning is the emergence of child soldiers in this conflict. We've documented both federal and coalition forces utilizing minors in support roles, as spotters, couriers, or in drone operation. Coalition forces in particular have established what they call youth defense cadres, where teenagers receive military training under the guise of community service. This represents a bright red line in conflict protocols, yet neither side acknowledges the practice.
There's another dimension to this conflict that receives little official attention: the targeting of medical facilities and personnel. Your teams have been directly affected by this phenomenon. Can you share what you've experienced?
Despite both sides publicly affirming the protected status of medical facilities and personnel, we've documented 47 attacks on hospitals, field clinics, and medical evacuation convoys in the past 3 weeks alone. Federal forces have conducted airstrikes on at least 8 hospitals they claim were being used as coalition command centers, while coalition forces have directly targeted medical convoys they suspected of evacuating federal personnel alongside civilian casualties. Our own teams operate under constant threat. We've lost 7 humanitarian workers in the past month, 3 to direct sniper fire while wearing clearly marked medical insignia, 2 to artillery strikes on marked field hospitals, and 2 to detention by coalition forces who accuse them of providing intelligence to federal units. The Central Alliance insignia that once guaranteed neutral status now seems to make our personnel targets from both sides.
What's particularly disturbing is the emergence of what military analysts call double tap strikes, an initial attack followed by a secondary strike targeting first responders. This tactic deliberately targets medical personnel rushing to assist casualties from the primary attack. We've documented at least 5 such incidents that appear deliberately designed to maximize casualties among medical responders.
Despite these horrific conditions, your teams continue to operate across contested territories. How are you maintaining humanitarian operations amid such extreme danger?
We've been forced to adapt our protocols in ways we never imagined necessary on American soil, Marion. Our medical teams now operate in hardened facilities with blast walls and underground components, more resembling combat field hospitals than traditional humanitarian aid stations. Personnel rotate through high-risk areas in 72-hour deployments to prevent stress-induced errors. Supply convoys travel at night with minimal marking, a radical departure from standard humanitarian practice that emphasizes high visibility.
Most significantly, we've established what we call direct community integration, training local volunteers in basic emergency medicine, water purification, and nutrition management, then supplying them to operate semi-independently when our teams cannot maintain presence due to security concerns. These community health networks are proving remarkably resilient, adapting to local conditions in ways our centralized response cannot. I want to emphasize that these adaptations, while necessary, represent a fundamental failure of both federal and coalition authorities to uphold their obligations to civilian populations under their control. The fact that we must operate like a military medical unit rather than a humanitarian organization reflects the complete collapse of established conflict protocols on American soil.
In your assessment, is there a humanitarian solution to this crisis, or are we witnessing the beginning of a protracted internal conflict?
I see 3 possible trajectories, Marion, none particularly hopeful in the near term. The first is military victory by federal forces, which would require urban combat operations of unprecedented scale in modern American history, with catastrophic civilian casualties and infrastructure destruction. The second is successful coalition resistance leading to de facto independence, which would leave a rump state with severely damaged infrastructure and limited international recognition. The third scenario, which I consider most likely, is protracted, low-intensity conflict lasting years or even decades. Neither side possesses the capability to achieve decisive victory, yet both have sufficient resources to prevent defeat. This scenario essentially institutionalizes the humanitarian crisis, creating generations of Americans who know nothing but conflict and deprivation. The one factor that gives me pause in this assessment is the extraordinary resilience and cooperation we're witnessing among ordinary Americans across political divides. While official narratives portray absolute polarization, on the ground we see constant examples of citizens rejecting these divisions to help neighbors regardless of political affiliation. Communities are developing autonomous solutions to immediate needs, food distribution, medical care, education, that operate outside both federal and coalition control structures. If there's hope for eventual resolution, it lies not in military victory by either side, but in this emerging grassroots rejection of the conflict itself. Americans are rediscovering that shared humanity transcends political identity, that keeping a child fed, a neighbor healthy,
or a community safe matters more than abstract questions of sovereignty or constitutional interpretation. Whether this bottom-up reconciliation can overcome the powerful interests perpetuating the conflict remains the central question of our time.
Lisa Fremont, thank you for sharing these difficult truths and for the life-saving work your teams perform daily in impossible conditions.
Thank you, Marion. If listeners take one message from this conversation, let it be this. Regardless of which authority you recognize or which narrative you believe, the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, and humanity must be upheld by all sides for this nation to survive as a functioning society. The moment we accept that civilians are legitimate targets or collateral damage, we lose something essential to our identity as Americans that no military victory can restore.
For Ground Truth, this is Marion Crane reporting from Denver. In a world of competing narratives, remember that human suffering is not a matter of interpretation. It's the one reality that transcends all political division.
This has been an independent production. The views expressed do not represent the official position of the Central Alliance or any other governmental authority.
The following address was broadcast on coalition emergency frequencies from a secure location in Oklahoma City. Jeff Jeffries, chair of the Interior States Coalition and acting Governor General, speaks regarding military developments and civilian conditions.
My fellow Americans, I speak to you today from the heart of our free territories as both our military forces and civilian communities face unprecedented challenges. 5 weeks into what history will record as America's second fight for independence, I must address the reality of our struggle with complete honesty. We face an opponent with overwhelming technological superiority. Federal forces command the skies with advanced aircraft. They deploy precision munitions guided by satellite systems. Their command networks operate through hardened infrastructure beyond our current capacity to match. Yet despite these advantages, federal forces find themselves in a military stalemate. Their superior technology cannot secure territory. Their precision weapons cannot eliminate our resistance. Their surveillance networks cannot distinguish friend from foe among a population that fundamentally rejects their authority. Federal propaganda characterizes our defense as terrorism and insurgency. Let me be clear. We are implementing precisely the strategy America's founders employed against an overwhelmingly superior British force: asymmetric engagement, utilizing intimate knowledge of our homeland while targeting military objectives and infrastructure that directly support federal operations. We adhere to established conflict standards despite federal claims to the contrary. This conflict will be neither brief nor decisively resolved through conventional victory. The coming months will bring hardship as federal forces increasingly target civilian infrastructure in desperate attempts to break our collective will. Our civil defense networks are establishing underground medical facilities, distributed supply caches, and emergency communication systems to support populations under direct threat. To those in federal territories who support our cause, know that you are not forgotten. The coalition extends its protection to all Americans who recognize constitutional limits on central authority. When conditions permit, secure evacuation corridors will be established for those wishing to relocate to coalition territories. To Central Alliance communities seeking neutrality, the coalition extends both respect and caution. We acknowledge your humanitarian objectives, but history teaches that centralized power, once unleashed from constitutional constraint, eventually consumes even those who sought to avoid its attention. To federal military personnel questioning their orders, I offer a direct message. You swore an oath to the Constitution not to any particular administration. When you are ordered to bomb American communities or implement measures that violate constitutional rights, you face a profound moral choice. The coalition guarantees honorable treatment for any federal personnel who choose constitutional loyalty over illegal orders. I speak with conviction about our ultimate victory, despite current challenges. Throughout human history, centralized authority has repeatedly attempted to crush decentralized resistance through superior technology. From the American Revolution to more recent conflicts worldwide, the will of a population fighting for self-determination eventually exhausts even the most powerful opponent's capacity to maintain control. Federal forces can bomb our cities and temporarily occupy our territory. What they cannot do is govern a population that fundamentally rejects their authority. They cannot maintain endless military operations across vast territories where every citizen is a potential resistance member. Time, geography, and moral legitimacy remain on our side. In the coming weeks, federal authorities will likely escalate their operations. Our response must combine military adaptation with community resilience. Every citizen has an essential role through direct service, resource production, community support, or simply maintaining absolute rejection of illegitimate federal authority. Fellow Americans, when we declared independence, we chose freedom with hardship over submission with comfort. We chose constitutional principle over administrative convenience. We chose the uncertain path of self-determination over the false security of centralized control. I close with words from Thomas Jefferson: "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." Our generation faces the profound responsibility of refreshing that tree after decades of surrender to centralized authority that would have been unrecognizable to our founders. May God bless and protect the free citizens of the Interior States Coalition. Until constitutional governance is restored to all American territories, we stand united in resistance, resolute in purpose, and unwavering in our commitment to liberty.
That was Jeff Jeffries, Coalition Chair and Acting Governor General, speaking from a secure location in Oklahoma City. This address was broadcast on emergency frequencies throughout Coalition territories and through unauthorized transmissions into federal and alliance regions. Broadcasting from a secure location within Central Alliance territory. 8 weeks into America's internal conflict, the combined death toll has surpassed 14,000, with civilian casualties now exceeding military losses by a ratio of nearly 3 to 1. Infrastructure damage has rendered over 30% of the nation's power grid inoperable, while critical water systems in 23 major metropolitan areas function at less than half capacity. The Battle of Cincinnati last week marked the conflict's deadliest urban engagement, with federal forces deploying tactical thermobaric weapons in densely populated areas after coalition units established fortified positions in residential districts. The resulting firestorm destroyed nearly 40% of the city center and left an estimated 2,300 civilians dead, many in basement shelters where oxygen was depleted by the intense combustion. Against this backdrop of escalating violence, a new pattern of urban governance is emerging in contested cities where neither federal nor coalition forces maintain consistent control. These shadow cities, as residents have begun to call them, function under complex, improvised systems of civilian authority that operate beneath the official battle lines. Tifa Lockhart has been documenting this phenomenon in St. Louis, a city fragmented into a patchwork of contested territories. Tifa, what are you witnessing?
John, I'm reporting from what locals call the Gray Zone, a 12-block area in central St. Louis caught between federal-controlled downtown and coalition-held western districts. This neighborhood has been the site of repeated military engagements over the past 5 weeks, with control shifting multiple times as both forces advance and retreat through urban terrain. Neither can effectively hold. What's emerged here is a remarkable example of community self-organization in the absence of stable military control. The official military map designates this neighborhood as contested territory, an area both sides claim but neither can secure due to its strategic location and complex urban terrain. Federal forces maintain fortified positions along the eastern perimeter, focusing primarily on protecting supply routes to their downtown stronghold. Coalition units operate mobile checkpoints along western and southern approaches, conducting occasional raids but lacking resources for permanent occupation. Between these military boundaries lies urban terrain, too costly in resources and potential casualties for either force to commit to holding, creating a vacuum where civilian governance has emerged by necessity. Hold on, John. We're hearing what sounds like artillery fire several blocks away. This is unusual for this time of day. Typically, both sides avoid daytime engagements in residential areas due to civilian visibility. I'm going to continue with my report while our security team assesses the situation. As I was saying, this community has established what they call the Neighborhood Council, representatives from each block who make decisions collectively regarding security, resource distribution, medical care, and dispute resolution. They've created identification cards that both federal and coalition checkpoints have begun to recognize, allowing residents limited movement to obtain supplies. The security situation appears to be escalating, John. We're seeing civilians moving to shelter locations according to community evacuation protocols. This is actually one of the shadow governance systems in action, organized civilian response to military threats without official direction. I'll continue as long as our position remains secure.
Tifa, if the situation is deteriorating, perhaps you should relocate to a safer position. Your safety takes priority over continuing the report.
We're assessing that now, John. Our local security contacts are indicating this may be a coalition probe rather than a major offensive. The pattern we're seeing matches previous limited engagements designed to test federal response capabilities rather than establish new territorial control. Actually, the situation is developing rapidly. We're seeing what appears to be drone activity overhead, which is unusual for coalition operations. This may be a new tactical approach or potentially a third.
We appear to be experiencing technical difficulties with Tifa's feed. We'll attempt to re-establish connection while continuing our examination of these shadow governance systems emerging in contested territories. Chris Redfield, our political analyst, joins us to discuss the constitutional and legal dimensions of these community structures. Chris, how do these shadow governments fit within American legal frameworks?
These emerging governance structures represent a fascinating constitutional paradox, John. They lack formal legitimacy under either federal or coalition frameworks, yet they exercise effective authority with the implicit consent of the governed. The fundamental basis of democratic legitimacy, according to both American tradition and political theory.
Ladies and gentlemen, it appears our broadcast location may be compromised. We're implementing emergency protocols while attempting to maintain transmission as long as possible. Chris, Please continue your analysis while our team assesses the situation.
Of course, as I was saying, these community governance systems represent both innovation and regression from a constitutional perspective. They embody direct democratic participation in its most elemental form, citizens collectively addressing immediate needs without bureaucratic intermediation, yet they operate without the protective frameworks established constitutional systems provide: separation of powers, judicial review, enumerated rights protections.
We are experiencing a security situation at our broadcast facility. We'll attempt to maintain transmission as long as safely possible. If our signal terminates unexpectedly, please know that independent journalism continues despite efforts to silence.
This is Delta Medical Coordinator broadcasting on emergency frequency 7.265 megahertz. Daily status update for all Shadow Zone medical facilities. Please report current capacity, critical supply shortages, and urgent transport needs. St. Louis Gray Zone. Check in, please.
Delta Medical, this is St. Louis Gray Zone reporting. Currently operating at 143% capacity across 5 underground facilities. Surgical Suite Alpha has functional generator power, but critical shortage of anesthetics. Surgical Suite Bravo operating on battery backup only. Estimate 6 hours remaining. Primary pediatric facility has stable power but reporting outbreak of respiratory infection, likely influenza, affecting 23 children. Urgent need for pediatric antibiotics, IV fluids, and ventilator components.
Copy, St. Louis. We can arrange transport of pediatric antibiotics and IV fluids from Central Alliance Depot within 36 hours. No ventilator components available at current supply points. Does anyone on this frequency have ventilator parts to spare for St. Louis Pediatric Facility?
St. Louis, this is Kansas City Shadow Medical. We salvaged ventilator components from abandoned hospital in Western Sector yesterday, can provide circuit boards, filters, and tubing compatible with standard models. Have functional but unstable transport route along Highway 70 if you can provide security coordination through Franklin County Checkpoint.
Kansas City, we can coordinate escort through Franklin County. Neighborhood Council has working relationship with checkpoint personnel. We'll need 12 hours to arrange permissions. Do you have capacity to transport burn patients on return journey? We have 3 pediatric burn cases stable enough for transfer but beyond our treatment capability.
Affirmative on burn patient transfer. Our facility Charlie has functional burn unit with 2 surgeons previously specialized in burn treatment. We'll prepare for patient reception. Be advised our route requires federal checkpoint clearance at mile marker 78. Can you provide patient documentation acceptable to federal authorities?
We have Central Alliance medical transfer credentials for all 3 patients. Federal checkpoints have been honoring these documents when accompanied by our medical personnel. We'll send Dr. Winters as escort physician. She has successfully transferred patients through federal checkpoints on 3 previous occasions.
Memphis Shadow Medical. Please check in with status update.
Delta Medical, this is Memphis reporting with urgent situation. Coalition forces have established new checkpoint 800 meters from our primary facility, restricting civilian movement in our sector. Simultaneously, federal drone surveillance has increased over our emergency transport routes. We have 47 critical patients requiring evacuation if either force attempts to occupy our facility.
Copy, Memphis. Are you still in communication with both federal and coalition liaison officers who previously provided non-engagement guarantees?
Federal liaison officer was replaced yesterday with new commander who does not recognize previous arrangement. Coalition liaison still honors agreement but warns they cannot prevent engagement if federal forces attempt to secure our sector. We have implemented blackout protocols and transferred most critical patients to sub-basement level, requesting guidance on evacuation options if situation deteriorates.
Memphis, Central Alliance Humanitarian Corridor Foxtrot remains open approximately 22 miles east of your position. We can coordinate emergency transport if you activate Protocol Midnight. Be advised this would require complete facility evacuation within 90-minute window. Confirm your capability to execute if necessary.
Confirm capability to execute Protocol Midnight if absolutely necessary. All staff briefed and positions assigned. Mobile equipment packed for immediate transport. Patient documentation prepared for checkpoint transit. We'll maintain current position as long as possible, but have established hourly decision points for potential evacuation initiation.
Louisville Shadow Medical. Please check in with status update.
Delta Medical, this is Louisville reporting stable but concerning situation. Our primary facilities remain secure within community governed sector. Federal and coalition forces both maintaining approximately 1.5 kilometer buffer zone around our medical district following community council negotiation. However, we've documented systematic disruption of supply routes by unidentified third parties. 3 supply convoys in the past 48 hours have been intercepted and redirected to private distribution networks. Drivers report individuals with corporate security credentials but no clear military affiliation establishing alternative distribution hubs and requiring all medical supplies to be routed through these facilities. Supplies eventually reach medical facilities, but quantities reduced by approximately 30% with no accounting for missing materials.
Louisville. This pattern matches reports from other sectors. Can you provide any identifying information about these corporate entities?
Personnel identified themselves as Aegis humanitarian distribution representatives. Credentials appeared professional, but our database shows no registration of this entity with any recognized humanitarian coordination body. Vehicles bore no consistent marking. Facility where supplies were rerouted had signage for regional emergency supply management, but no organizational affiliation listed.
Copy, Louisville. Document all such interactions with unaffiliated entities. We're compiling evidence of systematic interference with humanitarian supply chains by corporate actors. Central Alliance attorneys are preparing case documentation for potential post-conflict accountability processes. Little Rock Shadow Medical. Please check in with the status update.
Delta Medical. This is Little Rock reporting critical situation requiring immediate assistance. Federal airstrike approximately 90 minutes ago struck a water treatment facility 400 meters from our primary medical center. Blast damage has compromised structural integrity of our west wing. Currently evacuating 34 patients from affected areas. 3 medical personnel injured by secondary collapse. Urgent need for structural engineers to assess building safety and additional medical personnel to manage patient transfer.
Copy, Little Rock. Activating emergency response protocol. Central Alliance Rapid Response Team can deploy from Memphis within 30 minutes with structural specialists and medical support team. Confirm your landing zone status for helicopter insertion.
Primary landing zone compromised by debris. Secondary landing zone on Community College campus remains clear and secured by neighborhood council personnel. Will transmit coordinates on secure channel. Be advised all routes from landing zone to medical facility require passage through areas contested by local faction not aligned with either federal or coalition forces. Community Council liaison will meet helicopter to provide secure escort.
Columbus Shadow Medical. Please check in with status update.
Delta Medical, this is Columbus reporting. We've implemented the mixed-use facility model discussed in last week's coordination call. Medical operations now distributed across 17 residential basements connected by volunteer courier network. No visible medical infrastructure remains above ground level. Patient capacity reduced, but security profile substantially improved. No military engagement within our sector for past 96 hours. Most significant challenge is maintaining continuity of care with distributed model. We've implemented paper-based coordination system using bicycle couriers to maintain patient records across treatment locations. Local technical college students have developed low-power mesh network, allowing limited digital communication between facilities without detectable RF signature. Requesting additional training support for resident physicians operating in isolated microsites without senior supervision.
Copy, Columbus. Your distributed model shows promising security outcomes. We're documenting your implementation for potential adoption in other high-risk zones. Central Alliance Medical Education Team can provide remote mentorship for resident physicians. We'll coordinate encrypted tablet distribution with Next Supply Convoy. These devices contain peer-to-peer communication capability without external network requirements. I need to address a pattern identified across multiple shadow zones regarding blood supply management. All facilities should implement universal donation protocols regardless of faction control. Recent reports indicate some facilities in federal zones restricting blood donation eligibility based on suspected coalition sympathy and vice versa. This practice violates fundamental medical neutrality and endangers all patients. Blood donation and distribution must remain politically neutral processes. All facilities should access those documentation templates as needed. I want to remind everyone that our ethical obligation to patient care transcends any political affiliation or factional demands. The Shadow Medical Network exists to preserve the fundamental principle that medical care is a human right not a political commodity. When faced with demands that compromise this principle, our protocol remains clear. Protect patients first. Maintain neutrality always. Document violations for future accountability. Our final topic for today's coordination call concerns children separated from families during evacuation or combat operations. The Central Alliance has established a unified database of unaccompanied minors accessible to all Shadow medical facilities regardless of territorial control. If you encounter children without guardians, please document their information in this system, even if you cannot physically transfer them to Central Alliance facilities. This documentation is critical for eventual family reunification. Are there any other urgent matters requiring network-wide coordination?
Delta Medical, this is Kansas City with one final item. We've observed federal forces specifically targeting building-mounted solar arrays in coalition-controlled sectors, apparently to disable distributed power generation capability. Recommend all facilities relocate solar equipment to ground level or interior courtyards with overhead concealment. We've developed lightweight reflector systems that allow solar collection without roof exposure. Designs available through Secure Drop.
Thank you, Kansas City. All facilities should evaluate their power generation visibility and implement appropriate concealment measures. Remember that hospital designation symbols have unfortunately become targeting indicators in some sectors rather than protection markers. Maintain medical neutrality in all operations while minimizing visible signatures that could draw military attention. This concludes today's coordination call. Next scheduled network communication at 0600 hours tomorrow. Emergency channel remains open for urgent situations requiring immediate coordination. Remember our shared commitment. We treat humans, not uniforms. Delta Medical clear.
The following is a special report from Global News Service broadcasting from London. This report contains analysis of the ongoing American conflict from international perspectives. Viewer discretion is advised as some content may be disturbing.
Good evening. We begin with the devastating attack on the independent American network that has sent shockwaves through the international journalism community. Yesterday's coordinated drone strike on IAN's Central Alliance broadcasting facility claimed the lives of veteran anchor John Connor, political analyst Chris Redfield, and at least 14 production staff members. Field correspondent Tifa Lockhart, who was reporting from St. Louis when the attack occurred, remains missing and is feared dead after her last transmission reported similar drone activity in her location. The independent American network had provided some of the most reliable and balanced reporting throughout this conflict. Their commitment to factual journalism free from factional influence made them an essential source for both international media and humanitarian organizations attempting to understand the evolving crisis. This targeted elimination of independent journalists represents a disturbing escalation in what appears to be a coordinated campaign against non-aligned information sources. The attack was part of a broader pattern of coordinated strikes against independent media facilities across all three American territories. At least 14 broadcasting centers were targeted in synchronized drone operations, effectively eliminating most remaining non-factional information sources. Neither federal nor coalition forces have claimed responsibility, with both sides denying involvement while accusing the other of orchestrating the attacks. This information vacuum now leaves primarily faction-controlled channels presenting highly distorted narratives of the conflict. Our international security correspondent Vincent Vega joins us now from Geneva, where the International Committee of the Red Cross is coordinating humanitarian response. Vincent, what's the current assessment of the situation on the ground?
The humanitarian picture is grim and deteriorating rapidly, Richard.
Red Cross officials described the American crisis as the most complex humanitarian emergency since Syria, combining large-scale displacement, infrastructure collapse, and unprecedented information warfare that complicates aid delivery. Approximately 12 million Americans are now internally displaced, with conditions particularly severe in urban areas where power, water, and food distribution systems have largely collapsed. What distinguishes this conflict from others is the systemic targeting of civilian infrastructure by both primary belligerents. Federal forces continue high-altitude bombing of power and water facilities in coalition territories, while coalition forces sabotage transportation and communication networks in federal regions. The Central Alliance territories, while relatively more stable, face overwhelming refugee inflows that exceed capacity to provide basic services. International aid organizations report significant interference with humanitarian operations by all three American governance entities. What's particularly concerning about yesterday's coordinated attacks on media facilities, including the one that killed the IN News team?
Yesterday's synchronized strikes represent what European intelligence sources describe as a deliberate information warfare strategy, Richard. By targeting the remaining independent media outlets simultaneously, the perpetrators have eliminated most unaffiliated information sources, leaving primarily faction-controlled channels that present highly distorted narratives of the conflict. This creates what information warfare specialists call an epistemic crisis, where objective reality itself becomes contested territory. The elimination of respected journalists like John Connor is particularly significant. Connor had established credibility across factional lines through his commitment to verified reporting and balanced presentation. His team's consistent coverage provided essential context for understanding the conflict's evolution beyond partisan narratives. Without these independent voices, international organizations lose critical information necessary for humanitarian planning and civilian protection. What's most troubling is that neither federal nor coalition forces have claimed responsibility for these attacks. Both deny involvement while accusing the other side. EU intelligence assessment suggests the possibility of a third party orchestrating these strikes to deliberately accelerate information chaos. Several analysts point to corporate security contractors operating with unprecedented autonomy throughout American territories. The elimination of independent media creates conditions where manufactured narratives face minimal factual challenge, regardless of their relationship to ground reality.
Let's turn to the diplomatic dimensions. Mia Wallace joins us from the United Nations headquarters in New York, where emergency sessions continue regarding the American crisis. Mia, what's the international response to this escalating conflict?
The international community remains fundamentally divided on how to respond, Richard. 3 distinct diplomatic blocs have emerged, each advocating different approaches to the American situation. Western European nations and Canada continue recognizing the federal government as the legitimate authority, while expressing growing concern about its military tactics and human rights implications. A coalition of nations led by Brazil and South Africa advocate formal recognition of all 3 American governance entities as legitimate representatives of their respective territories. China, Russia, and their aligned states maintain strict non-intervention positions while establishing separate diplomatic channels with each American faction. What complicates international response is the unprecedented nature of this situation. The fragmenting of a nuclear-armed Permanent Security Council member raises profound questions about command and control of strategic weapons, continuity of treaty obligations, and international financial system stability. The General Assembly has authorized humanitarian operations but stopped short of peacekeeping proposals due to Russian and Chinese vetoes of any military intervention framework. The most significant recent development is the increasing role of corporate entities in diplomatic channels. The Shinra Group and several other multinational conglomerates have established what they term stability facilitation offices that effectively function as parallel diplomatic missions connecting the fragmented American governance structures with international institutions. These corporate intermediaries increasingly control access to American territories for humanitarian organizations, media, and even official diplomatic missions, a privatization of international relations without precedent in modern diplomatic history.
The economic impact extends far beyond American borders. Amira Kazemi joins us from the Singapore Exchange to discuss the global financial implications. Amira, how are markets responding to this continued instability?
Global markets demonstrate what economists call crisis adaptation, Richard, essentially pricing in American instability as the new normal rather than temporary disruption. After initial panic selling when hostilities began, markets have established new equilibrium points that assume continued American fragmentation rather than rapid resolution. The dollar has stabilized at approximately 40% of its pre-conflict value against a basket of major currencies, while gold and other traditional safe havens maintain historically high valuations. What's particularly noteworthy is the sectoral distribution of market activity. Defense contractors, private security firms, and infrastructure reconstruction specialists continue strong performance across all major exchanges. The Shinra Group specifically has seen share value increase 208% since conflict initiation, despite having significant pre-war American exposure. Their strategic positioning across all three American territories insulates them from factional outcomes while providing unprecedented opportunities in privatized governance functions previously performed by state entities. The most concerning indicator is what's happening with American sovereign debt. As federal, coalition, and alliance authorities all claim legitimate successor status to pre-conflict Treasury obligations, international holders face fundamental uncertainty about future servicing of these instruments. Chinese and Japanese institutional holders have begun accepting discounted buyout offers from private financial entities, effectively transferring sovereign obligations to corporate balance sheets. This unprecedented privatization of sovereign debt creates potential for corporate entities to exercise creditor leverage over whatever governance structures eventually stabilize in American territories.
Let's examine the technological dimensions of this conflict. Dr. Jules Winfield joins us from the Cambridge Institute for Strategic Analysis. Dr. Winfield, what distinguishes this conflict from previous civil wars from a technological perspective?
This represents the world's first true information age civil conflict, Richard, with several unprecedented characteristics that fundamentally challenge traditional conflict analysis frameworks. First, we're witnessing sophisticated cyber operations targeting civilian infrastructure at scale never before seen in internal conflicts. Second, algorithmic information operations manipulate perception across all communications channels still functioning. Third, autonomous weapon systems deploy without meaningful human oversight in densely populated areas. These elements combine to create what military theorists call full-spectrum destabilization, simultaneous physical, informational, and cognitive infrastructure collapse. What particularly concerning is evidence suggesting much of this technological warfare originates from non-state actors rather than the primary belligerents. Our analysis indicates sophisticated corporate entities are deploying advanced capabilities that neither federal nor coalition forces fully understand or control. These corporate actors appear to be deliberately prolonging and managing conflict intensity to create optimal conditions for what disaster capitalism scholars call sovereignty arbitrage, the transfer of governance functions to private entities during state failure. The most alarming technological development is what we are observing in surveillance and social control systems deployed across all territories. Population management technologies, previously existing only in research environments, are being field implemented through emergency authorities. Biometric identification systems, behavior prediction algorithms, and automated compliance enforcement mechanisms are being integrated with essential resource distribution. These systems establish technical control architectures that will persist regardless of which faction eventually claims territorial governance, effectively hardwiring private oversight into basic social functions without democratic input or oversight.
Returning to the human dimension, we're joined by Dr. Fabienne Coolidge from Médecins Sans Frontières, who recently returned from Central Alliance territories. Dr. Coolidge, what can you tell us about the humanitarian situation facing ordinary Americans?
The situation represents the most severe humanitarian crisis in a developed nation since World War II, Richard. Beyond the direct conflict casualties, we're documenting catastrophic secondary mortality from infrastructure collapse, waterborne disease outbreaks in 17 major urban centres, medication shortages affecting approximately 38 million Americans with chronic conditions, hypothermia deaths in northern regions as heating systems fail amid early winter conditions. These indirect casualties now significantly exceed direct combat deaths and will accelerate as infrastructure degradation continues. What particularly disturbing is the obstruction of humanitarian operations by all governance factions. Federal authorities implement security protocols that prevent aid delivery to areas with suspected coalition sympathy. Coalition forces divert humanitarian shipments to support military operations. Even alliance territories, initially the most cooperative with international aid efforts, increasingly subject humanitarian organizations to restrictive operational conditions determined by private contractors managing resource distribution. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. We're documenting acute trauma responses across all demographic categories. Children exhibit developmental regression, attachment disorders, and trauma-induced behavioral changes that will persist for generations. Adult populations display symptoms consistent with collective trauma, including disassociation, hypervigilance, and fragmented social trust. These psychological impacts represent potentially the most enduring consequence of this conflict, the traumatization of an entire generation that will shape American social function for decades, regardless of political outcomes.
What you're describing sounds disturbingly similar to conditions previously observed only in developing nations experiencing state failure. Is there any cause for hope amid this catastrophic situation?
What provides some basis for cautious optimism is the remarkable resilience and self-organisation we observe at community levels, Richard. Despite governance collapse and infrastructure failure, neighbourhood-scale cooperation emerges consistently across all territories. Communities develop sophisticated resource-sharing systems, security cooperation frameworks, and mutual aid networks that operate beneath factional divisions. These grassroots adaptations demonstrate fundamental human capacity for cooperation that transcends the artificial boundaries this conflict has imposed. Most remarkable is what conflict resolution specialists call recognition events, moments when individuals across factional lines recognize their common exploitation by forces benefiting from their division. We've documented increasing instances of federal and coalition supporters cooperating to address immediate community needs despite official narratives demanding factional loyalty. These micro-reconciliations represent potential seeds for eventual broader resolution if they can overcome the sophisticated systems working to maintain division and prevent unified resistance against exploitation.
As we conclude this special report, what should international audiences understand about this devastating situation that might not be immediately apparent?
The most important insight, Richard, is recognizing that what appears as chaotic breakdown may actually represent orchestrated transformation. The patterns emerging across American territories suggest not random conflict effects, but implementation of what disaster capitalism scholars call managed state failure, the deliberate creation of governance vacuums that private entities can fill without democratic processes or accountability mechanisms, the elimination of independent media, the degradation of public infrastructure, the deliberate acceleration of factional conflict. These create perfect conditions for fundamental reconstruction of governance relationships, with citizens having minimal input into resulting structures. What emerges from this conflict may superficially resemble democratic governance while functioning primarily as resource extraction and population management architecture controlled by entities that engineered the very crisis enabling their authority.
A sobering assessment. We'll continue monitoring developments as this crisis evolves. Our thoughts remain with the American people suffering through this catastrophic situation. For Global News Service, I'm Richard Harrington in London.
This has been a Global News Service special report. Our coverage of the American crisis continues at the top of each hour with updates from our correspondents across all affected territories.
This is Late Night America on Secure Frequency 1. I'm Vincent Valentine. 3 days ago, John Connor, Chris Redfield, and their entire production team were killed when their Denver broadcast facility was hit during a live transmission. Tifa Lockhart remains missing after the St. Louis Center was attacked mid-report. Tonight, as we mourn these journalists, we're hearing from people witnessing the Chicago siege and Washington buildup. Our line is open at 55 Night Hope. Sarah from Illinois, you're on.
I'm a paramedic in Chicago's West Side. The siege started with coordinated strikes on infrastructure. Traffic systems, cell towers, power stations, all hit within minutes. Half the city lost power and communications by dawn. Federal forces took defensive positions downtown while coalition units appeared in the western suburbs. The first major clash was at O'Hare. Federal troops had barricaded runways using commercial aircraft. Coalition hit them with modified agricultural drones carrying explosives. When the runway defenses broke, it became building-to-building fighting toward the terminals. We're running a medical station in a high school gym. The injuries tell the real story. Close-range gunshot wounds, homemade explosive trauma, civilians caught in crossfire, plus wounds from collapsing infrastructure. Both sides are fighting for Chicago like it's just another objective, not understanding it's the transportation hub for the entire country. If this infrastructure is destroyed, supply chains across America will collapse for months. Since John Connor's team was killed, there's no middle ground in reporting anymore. Federal broadcasts claim they're securing Chicago against terrorist infiltration, while I'm watching neighborhoods burn from artillery. Coalition claims they've liberated western districts, where I treated civilians hit by their snipers yesterday. Without independent voices bridging that gap, people are retreating into completely separate realities.
Michael from Indiana, you're on Late Night America.
I'm a truck driver who got trapped in Chicago when the fighting started. Federal forces aren't just defending, they're preparing for a last stand. Every construction vehicle in a central district is building fortifications. Office buildings are now barracks. Parking structures are ammunition depots. The Willis Tower is a military command center with equipment installed on the upper floors. Coalition forces aren't concentrating for a direct assault. They're setting up what military folks call distributed fire bases throughout the western and southern suburbs. Small, heavily armed positions that can defend themselves but aren't strong enough to attack alone. It's like they're creating a net around the city rather than a spear point. The most telling thing was at the southern rail yard, federal troops weren't guarding military equipment, they were protecting loading cranes and shipping containers. They're prioritizing logistics infrastructure over tactical positions. Coalition forces are doing the same, seizing fuel depots and warehouses rather than pushing for territory. And while everyone watches Chicago, both sides are moving forces toward Washington. I passed 3 separate military convoys heading east during my escape. This Chicago siege might be a diversion for something bigger happening in the capital.
Rebecca from Maryland, you're on Late Night America.
I worked Pentagon Communications until 3 days ago. The strikes against those 14 media facilities weren't the work of either side alone. The operation required coordination across territories and defeat of separate air defense systems. Neither faction has that capability independently. 2 weeks ago, military planners from both sides received identical satellite intelligence on Chicago, just packaged differently. That data came from private contractor sources, not military reconnaissance. Both commands were effectively maneuvered into this confrontation by information from the same source. John Connor and his team were preparing a report on conflict symmetry patterns, evidence that both sides' military operations were being shaped by shared external influence. The day before they were killed, they'd requested documents about private security contractor deployments in Chicago from sources in both command structures. What's happening in Chicago and building around Washington follows a pattern called controlled escalation theater, conflict designed to look chaotic while actually following a predetermined plan. With independent journalists eliminated, there's nobody left to identify these patterns publicly. The attack profile that killed Connor's team matches strike patterns developed by private contractors, not standard military doctrine. The precision, timing, and simultaneous execution require capabilities neither faction possesses. The drones use countermeasures that defeat both sides' defense systems, technology only available through corporate channels. Washington terrifies me because I see the same pattern developing, but now without journalists like Connor to expose it.
James from Illinois, final caller tonight.
I'm coordinating civilian evacuation from Chicago's northwest neighborhoods. Most of Chicago's 8 million residents aren't aligned with either faction. We're just trying to survive while our city becomes a battlefield. The immediate crisis is infrastructure collapse. Chicago's water system needs electrical pumps. With power failing, water doesn't reach above first floors in many buildings. High-rises have become death traps as temperatures rise and water supplies fail. We're evacuating elderly residents stranded without water for days. With cell networks down, an emergency broadcast controlled by competing factions. Neighborhoods are making decisions based on fragments of information. Some people evacuate directly into active fighting because they're following outdated guidance. Since John Connor's network went dark, there's no trusted information source reaching all communities. We started using pre-digital methods, bicycle messengers, bulletin boards, community representatives traveling between districts. The most hopeful sign is how quickly neighborhood councils are formed. These aren't aligned with either faction, just local residents with useful skills organizing to keep their communities functioning.
Tonight, we honor John Connor, Chris Redfield, Jamie Woods, and the entire Independent American Network team. Their commitment to factual reporting above factual narrative represents the principle that informed citizenship requires access to reality beyond manufactured division. The convergence of Chicago's siege, Washington's buildup, and the elimination of independent media creates an inflection point. Without trusted voices providing perspective beyond factional broadcasts, communities must develop their own information networks. When centralized information becomes weaponized, distributed truth-finding becomes essential survival infrastructure. This is Vincent Valentine reminding you that when journalism dies, democracy follows. But human connection and truth-seeking persist despite every system designed to corrupt them. Document what you witness, share what you know. Remember that survival depends not on which broadcast you believe, but on your capacity to verify reality through direct human connection. Good night, America.
You're watching Federal Broadcast Network, the voice of constitutional authority. The following is a special report on ongoing security operations in the greater Chicago metropolitan area.
Good evening, fellow Americans. I'm Victoria Hargrove, reporting from our Secure Broadcast Center in downtown Chicago. 12 weeks into this insurrectionist crisis, federal forces continue to successfully defend America's vital Midwest transportation hub against terrorist elements trying to undermine legitimate government authority. Despite rebel propaganda claiming a siege of Chicago, the reality on the ground shows the strength of our infrastructure and the professionalism of our defense forces. Federal military authorities have confirmed complete control of all essential facilities within the metro area. O'Hare Airport, the Chicago River transportation corridors, and all key distribution centers remain fully operational under comprehensive security protocols. The Midwest Federal Command continues to carry out its constitutional duties from the Emergency Operations Center, maintaining uninterrupted control over all federal military and civilian functions, despite rebel attempts to claim otherwise. Let's turn to our Defense Department correspondent, Michael Reynolds, who's embedded with federal security forces near the Lake Michigan perimeter. Michael, what's the situation from your position?
Victoria, I'm with the 101st Airborne Division's forward elements about 3 miles west of Navy Pier. Federal forces maintain complete control of all approaches to the city, with multiple security layers creating what commanders here call an impenetrable defense in depth. The rebel narrative of encirclement is pure disinformation designed to create psychological impact rather than reflecting reality. What we're seeing is not a siege, but a comprehensive security operation successfully containing terrorist elements at safe distances from critical infrastructure. Federal air superiority remains absolute, with continuous combat air patrols intercepting any unauthorized aircraft trying to enter the city's protected airspace. Naval assets on Lake Michigan keep waterway security tight, ensuring uninterrupted supply lines to federal positions. Ground forces have established fortified positions at all major transit routes with overlapping fields of fire, creating secure corridors. The operational reality here bears no resemblance to rebel propaganda suggesting government vulnerability. Federal command structures remain intact, communication networks function at full capacity, and logistics systems ensure all military and essential civilian needs are met without interruption. The terrorist elements positioned outside our security perimeter lack both the military capability and operational coordination to present any real threat to constitutional authority in America's transportation heartland.
Thank you, Michael. For perspective on civilian conditions in the Chicago region, we're joined by Federal Military Liaison Thomas Doyle. Major Doyle, what's the status of essential services and civilian welfare in the metropolitan area?
The civilian situation remains well managed through comprehensive emergency protocols, Victoria. Essential services, power, water, and emergency medical care continue functioning at sufficient capacity throughout all secured zones. Resource distribution systems operate according to established emergency plans, ensuring all registered citizens receive adequate food, water, and basic necessities. Federal security forces maintain effective civilian protection throughout all residential districts under government control. I want to directly address the rebel propaganda regarding so-called humanitarian crisis conditions. These fabricated stories deliberately misrepresent standard emergency resource management as deprivation. Rationing protocols reflect strategic optimization of essential supplies rather than shortage conditions. Population density management represents efficient security implementation rather than civilian restriction. Medical service prioritization follows standard triage protocols rather than healthcare collapse. These measures represent professional emergency management working exactly as designed during national security contingencies. Citizens within the Chicago metropolitan area should maintain complete confidence in federal authorities. Our emergency management systems incorporate decades of professional expertise and operational experience. The temporary inconveniences some civilians experience represent necessary adaptations to security realities rather than systemic failures. Those experiencing genuine hardship should register immediately with authorized federal emergency management personnel through established channels, rather than seeking unauthorized assistance that may connect them with rebel elements.
For analysis on the broader strategic situation, we're joined by National Security Advisor Dr. Wyatt Holliday. Dr. Holliday, how does the current Chicago security operation fit within the overall counterinsurgency effort?
The Chicago security operation represents a critical element of our comprehensive national strategy, successfully containing the insurrectionist threat. Federal forces maintain control of all strategically significant territory throughout the eastern seaboard, Great Lakes region, and western coastal states. The terrorist elements operating in interior regions lack industrial capacity, supply infrastructure, and international recognition necessary for sustained operations. Our intelligence shows increasing fragmentation within rebel leadership as resource constraints and internal conflicts undermine their temporary cohesion. What's particularly important for citizens to understand is the strategic significance of Chicago. This metropolitan area represents America's most vital internal transportation hub, connecting rail, air, road, and waterway logistics that sustain our national economy. By securing this critical infrastructure against rebel disruption, federal forces ensure continued supply chain resilience throughout loyal territories, while systematically limiting resource availability in regions under terrorist influence. This advantage guarantees the ultimate success of constitutional restoration, regardless of temporary tactical developments in peripheral regions. The current security situation represents the predictable evolution of insurgency suppression operations. After initial rapid expansion leveraging surprise and hit-and-run tactics, rebel elements now face the reality of strategic overextension, resource depletion, and leadership fragmentation. Their increasingly desperate attacks near Chicago's perimeter represent psychological operations rather than militarily significant maneuvers. Federal strategic patience will ultimately prevail as insurgent capacity deteriorates under pressure from legitimate security forces.
Some citizens have expressed concern about so-called independent reports suggesting third-party manipulation of both federal and insurrectionist forces. How do you respond to these narratives?
These conspiracy theories represent classic information warfare tactics, deliberate disinformation designed to create false equivalence between legitimate constitutional authority and terrorist violence. By suggesting shadowy manipulation of both sides, these narratives attempt to undermine the fundamental moral clarity of our current situation, legitimate government defending constitutional order against violent insurrection, attempting to fragment our nation. The timing of these conspiracy narratives is particularly revealing, emerging precisely as federal forces gain strategic momentum against rebel elements. This represents a classic desperation tactic when terrorists recognize their military defeat is inevitable. By creating elaborate conspiracy frameworks suggesting external manipulation, they attempt to justify their inevitable failure while creating false narratives that might survive their military defeat. These information operations deserve no credibility from loyal citizens committed to constitutional governance. What's particularly important is recognizing the technical signatures of this disinformation campaign. Federal intelligence agencies have identified sophisticated artificial intelligence deployment, generating falsified evidence of corporate manipulation. These fabricated materials show technical characteristics consistent with foreign adversary capabilities rather than domestic sources. Citizens should maintain complete skepticism toward any materials suggesting equivalence between federal authority and terrorist elements, regardless of superficial authenticity markers.
As we conclude this special report, what message should citizens throughout federal territories understand about the current situation?
The most important understanding is maintaining absolute confidence in constitutional processes and legitimate authority despite temporary disruption. Victoria. What we're experiencing is not unprecedented in American history. Our nation has faced internal division and insurrectionist violence before, from the Whiskey Rebellion through the Civil War to more recent domestic terrorism incidents. In each case, constitutional authority ultimately prevailed through disciplined application of legitimate security functions combined with citizen loyalty to fundamental governance principles. Federal citizens should continue their essential contributions through workplace productivity, resource conservation, and security vigilance, report suspicious activities through authorized channels, maintain registration compliance with emergency management systems, disregard unauthorized information sources that may contain rebel propaganda, support legitimate security operations in your communities through cooperation with authorized personnel. These civilian contributions directly strengthen our national resilience during this temporary security challenge. The current insurrectionist threat, while significant, represents a temporary disruption rather than existential challenge to American governance. Constitutional authority remains intact, security forces maintain operational superiority, and international recognition confirms federal legitimacy. With continued citizen support and strategic patience, legitimate governance will be restored throughout all American territories through professional security operations conducted according to constitutional principles and established legal frameworks.
Thank you, Dr. Holliday, for that clear perspective on our current national situation. This concludes our special report on Chicago security operations. Federal Broadcast Network will continue providing accurate information throughout this national security situation. Remember, stay informed through authorized channels, remain vigilant, and maintain confidence in constitutional authority. I'm Victoria Hargrove reporting from Federal Broadcast Center. Good night and God bless America.
You've been watching Federal Broadcast Network, the voice of constitutional authority. All citizens are reminded that accessing unauthorized information sources may constitute material support for insurrectionist activities under Emergency Security Directive 47B. Report unauthorized broadcasts to your local Federal Communications Compliance Office.
You're watching Coalition Liberty Network, Truth Without Compromise. The following is a freedom briefing on the liberation operations surrounding the federal occupation zone of Chicago.
Good evening, free Americans. I'm Daniel Freeman, broadcasting from our mobile transmission facility near the Illinois-Indiana border. 12 weeks into our struggle to restore constitutional rights, Coalition Liberation Forces have established effective tactical encirclement of the regime's critical Midwest logistics hub. The siege of Chicago represents a strategic milestone in our historic mission to restore legitimate constitutional governance and end the authoritarian overreach that triggered this necessary conflict. Coalition military sources confirm that our forces now control all major ground transportation routes within artillery range of the regime's supply chains. The occupation government's desperate propaganda claiming secure perimeters and defense in depth can't hide the fundamental reality visible to any honest observer. A logistically paralyzed regime trapped in an increasingly isolated urban fortress, while America's agricultural heartland breathes free under restored constitutional governance. Let's turn to our frontline correspondent, Sarah Jenkins, embedded with Coalition Advance elements near Joliet. Sarah, what are you seeing from your position?
Daniel, I'm with the Illinois Freedom Battalion about 20 miles southwest of Chicago's downtown corridor. From here, we can see multiple signs of regime desperation despite their continuing propaganda broadcasts. Constant helicopter activity above their central command suggests frantic resupply operations rather than the routine rotations their military spokesmen claim. The nighttime glow from emergency generators reveals the failure of their power infrastructure despite official denials of grid vulnerability. Coalition liberation forces maintain disciplined positions along all major approach routes. Unlike the regime's indiscriminate bombing of rural communities, our forces use precision targeting specifically designed to minimize civilian casualties while systematically degrading occupation government capabilities. Artillery operations focus exclusively on military installations and command infrastructure rather than civilian areas. Drone operations target communications facilities and transportation nodes rather than residential districts. This disciplined approach shows our fundamental commitment to constitutional restoration rather than vengeful destruction. What's particularly significant is the increasing flow of defectors from regime-held territory. In the past 72 hours alone, our forward positions have processed over 200 logistics personnel who recognize their oath to the Constitution rather than any particular administration. These patriotic Americans bring critical intelligence regarding deteriorating conditions within the occupation zone and confirmation of the regime's increasingly desperate measures to maintain the facade of control over America's vital transportation hub.
Thank you, Sarah. For perspective on civilian conditions within the occupation zone, we're joined by Dr. Robert Williams from the Coalition Humanitarian Affairs Committee. Dr. Williams, what information do we have regarding the population still trapped under regime control in Chicago?
The humanitarian situation within the Chicago occupation zone represents the inevitable consequence of authoritarian governance prioritizing control over human welfare, Daniel. According to reliable sources inside the restricted area, civilians face severe rationing of essential supplies including food, water, and medical resources. The regime's emergency management system functions primarily as a population control mechanism rather than genuine humanitarian assistance, with resource access explicitly tied to compliance with increasingly intrusive monitoring and behavioral requirements. Particularly concerning are reports of transportation prioritization that puts civilian medical needs behind military logistics. Multiple sources confirm that Chicago's renowned medical facilities operate under military supervision with critical supplies and transportation assets reserved for regime-affiliated patients. Emergency medical evacuations for civilian casualties are reportedly denied when conflicting with military transport requirements. These practices violate basic medical ethics and humanitarian principles that the occupation government hypocritically claims to uphold. Coalition humanitarian operations maintain readiness to provide immediate assistance once liberation is complete. Our medical teams are positioned near all major approach routes with comprehensive supply capacity for civilian treatment, regardless of previous political affiliation. Food distribution systems stand ready to address critical shortages resulting from the regime's mismanagement. Temporary shelter facilities have been established throughout liberated territories to accommodate displaced persons until safe return to their communities becomes possible. Unlike the regime's discriminatory assistance model, coalition humanitarian operations will serve all Americans according to need rather than political compliance.
For analysis on the broader strategic situation, we're joined by General James Montgomery, Coalition Defense Council Coordinator. General Montgomery, how does the Chicago operation fit within the overall liberation framework?
The Chicago encirclement represents a critical strategic pivot rather than isolated tactical maneuver, Daniel. Coalition forces now control approximately 65% of American territory, including all major agricultural regions, energy production facilities, and transportation infrastructure connecting the heartland. By isolating Chicago's transportation nexus, we effectively sever the regime's logistical connection between eastern and western occupation zones, forcing them to rely on increasingly vulnerable air corridors that our air defense capabilities systematically degrade. What's particularly important for citizens to understand is the economic dimension of this operation. Chicago represents the critical link in the regime's increasingly fragile supply chain, the essential hub connecting coastal urban enclaves to vital Midwestern resources. By establishing control over surrounding transportation infrastructure, coalition forces create asymmetric resource advantage that ensures inevitable constitutional restoration, regardless of temporary tactical developments in peripheral regions.
Our approach to Chicago specifically reflects the coalition's fundamental commitment to constitutional restoration rather than retribution. We maintain constant communication channels for regime surrender negotiations that would prevent unnecessary destruction of civilian infrastructure and minimize additional casualties. Our encirclement strategy deliberately includes multiple potential evacuation corridors for civilian departure. Our operational timeline incorporates deliberate patience to allow for potential negotiated resolution rather than forced military conclusion. These measures demonstrate the profound moral distinction between constitutional restoration forces and the authoritarian regime we seek to replace.
Recent unauthorized broadcasts have suggested so-called corporate manipulation of both coalition and regime forces. How do you respond to these conspiracy narratives?
These fabricated stories represent classic psychological warfare tactics. Daniel, desperate regime disinformation designed to create false equivalence between constitutional restoration forces and authoritarian occupation. By manufacturing elaborate conspiracy frameworks suggesting external manipulation, the regime attempts to undermine the fundamental moral clarity of our struggle. Patriotic Americans restoring constitutional governance against authoritarian power that abandoned all legitimate boundaries. The timing of these disinformation operations is particularly revealing, emerging precisely as the regime's strategic position in the Midwest becomes increasingly untenable. Long-grip propagandists recognize that Chicago's isolation fundamentally threatens their resource distribution systems. These elaborate conspiracy narratives attempt to create alternative explanation for their deteriorating position while establishing post-conflict narratives that might survive their military defeat. Such desperate measures deserve no credibility from Americans committed to constitutional restoration. What's particularly important is recognizing the technical signatures of this disinformation campaign. Coalition intelligence units have identified sophisticated artificial intelligence deployment, generating falsified evidence of corporate influence over liberation operations. These fabricated materials show technical characteristics consistent with regime psychological warfare capabilities rather than genuine investigative journalism. Patriots should maintain absolute skepticism toward any materials suggesting equivalence between constitutional restoration forces and the illegitimate regime, regardless of superficial authenticity markers.
As we conclude this Freedom Briefing, what message should citizens throughout liberated territories understand about the current situation?
The most important understanding is that the Chicago operation represents strategic inflection rather than merely tactical development, Daniel. By isolating this essential transportation nexus, coalition forces effectively divide the regime's remaining territories while ensuring resource advantage throughout our constitutional governance areas. This represents not merely military progression, but fundamental economic reconfiguration, restoring America's agricultural and energy resources to legitimate constitutional authority rather than authoritarian mismanagement. Coalition citizens should continue their essential contributions through community cooperation, local governance participation, and production of resources necessary for both liberation operations and civilian welfare. Support your local Constitutional Restoration Committee. Report suspicious activities potentially indicating regime infiltration. Maintain skepticism toward unauthorized information sources potentially containing regime propaganda. These civilian contributions directly strengthen our collective resilience during this critical phase of liberation operations. When Chicago returns to constitutional governance in the coming weeks, we will restore America's vital transportation hub to its proper function, serving productive commerce among free citizens rather than authoritarian resource extraction. Unlike the regime's exploitative approach, coalition authorities will implement genuine economic revitalization based on constitutional principles rather than centralized control. Transportation workers who serve the regime through economic necessity rather than ideological commitment will find path to reintegration through honest participation rather than punitive measures. Our governance model will restore the free flow of resources our founders envisioned rather than merely replacing one control architecture with another. This commitment to economic liberty rather than authoritarian management fundamentally distinguishes our cause from the regime we replace.
Thank you, General Montgomery, for that clarifying perspective on our liberation mission. This concludes our Freedom Briefing on the Chicago encirclement operation. Coalition Liberty Network will continue providing uncompromised truth throughout this historic restoration period. Remember, stay informed through Patriot channels, support your local restoration committees, and maintain absolute faith in our constitutional cause. I'm Daniel Freeman, broadcasting from the front lines of American freedom. Good night, and God bless the true constitutional republic we're restoring together.
You've been watching Coalition Liberty Network, Truth Without Compromise. Patriots are reminded that sharing broadcasting frequencies and equipment with freedom broadcasters is essential to circumventing regime information controls. Contact your local communications restoration team to contribute to the free flow of constitutional truth.
In times of uncertainty, stability matters more than ever. When traditional systems face unprecedented challenges, innovative solutions become essential. When communities need support, expertise makes all the difference. Introducing Shinra Group, your partner in navigating America's evolving landscape. For over 2 decades, Shinra has delivered results where others see only challenges. Our integrated approach combines security expertise, infrastructure resilience, and community support into seamless solutions tailored to America's emerging needs.
While others debate the problems, Shinra delivers answers. Our Secure Communities initiative has already protected over 3 million Americans in transitional zones. Our infrastructure specialists maintain critical systems when traditional support fails. Our logistics network ensures essential supplies reach those most vulnerable, regardless of location or affiliation.
This isn't just business. This is our commitment to America's future. In neighborhoods across the country, Shinra presence means the difference between chaos and stability. When federal authorities couldn't maintain essential services, our team stepped in with immediate solutions. When local communities faced resource shortages, our supply networks bridged the gap. When security concerns threatened vulnerable populations, our protection teams established safe zones where families could thrive. The results speak for themselves. Communities with Shinra's partnerships report 78% higher resource availability. Infrastructure under our management maintains 92% operational capacity despite challenging conditions. Regions with our security protocols experience 65% fewer disruptive incidents. These aren't just statistics. They represent real improvements in American lives during unprecedented times. At Shinra, we believe America's challenges represent unprecedented opportunities. Our vision transcends traditional boundaries, geographic, political, and institutional. Where others see division, we see the foundation for a more resilient, efficient, and prosperous future. Shinra's Reconstruction Readiness Program is already designing the infrastructure of tomorrow. Our community governance specialists are developing adaptive frameworks that function regardless of political evolution. Our security architecture ensures stability during transition and beyond. This moment in history calls for more than conventional thinking. It demands partners with the vision to see beyond current circumstances, the capability to implement at unprecedented scale, and the commitment to America's long-term prosperity. Shinra Group, building a stronger tomorrow, today.
Shinra Group and subsidiaries maintain operational neutrality in current territorial disputes. Security services provided in compliance with applicable emergency authorities. Infrastructure support available in selected regions subject to security assessment. Reconstruction services contingent on stabilization protocols determined by Shinra Risk Management Division. Not all services available in all areas. Stability guarantees subject to force majeure exclusions including but not limited to military action by recognized governmental authorities.
This is Marion Crane broadcasting on secure frequency 121.77. If you're hearing my voice, you're part of the shrinking circle of Americans with access to non-factional information. 9 days have passed since the coordinated attacks on independent media facilities that claimed the lives of John Connor and his team at the Central Alliance Broadcast Center. Similar strikes eliminated 14 other independent news operations across all territories, effectively silencing non-aligned journalism in a single day. The Independent Journalist Network maintains this emergency broadcast through constantly rotating frequencies and mobile transmission equipment. We operate without institutional protection, studio facilities, or reliable supply chains. Our team consists of journalists who escaped the purge, supported by a network of civilians committed to information freedom regardless of territorial affiliation. Our broadcast must remain brief to avoid signal tracking. We prioritize verified information over speculation despite increasingly challenging verification conditions. Today's primary development involves what military analysts call distributed insurgent operation, expanding dramatically beyond established conflict zones. Regions previously considered secure, at least 200 miles from recognized front lines, now report coordinated attacks against infrastructure, supply networks, and administrative facilities. These operations demonstrate sophisticated tactical coordination despite their geographic dispersion, suggesting centralized planning despite appearing spontaneous. Federal territories report simultaneous strikes against power distribution networks across the Northeast and Upper Midwest. Coalition-controlled regions document targeting of transportation infrastructure throughout the southern and central states. Even Central Alliance territories, previously insulated from direct military operations, now experience coordinated disruption of communication systems and water treatment facilities. These attacks demonstrate precise knowledge of vulnerabilities and security protocols that theoretically remain classified within each faction's command structure. The official narratives from all sides attribute these operations to enemy infiltration. Federal authorities claim coalition terrorist cells operating behind their lines. Coalition leadership blames federal death squads attempting to destabilize their governance. Alliance officials suggest both factions conducting false flag operations in neutral territories. The symmetrical nature of these accusations itself raises questions about their accuracy. Our investigation has documented disturbing patterns suggesting third-party involvement, transcending factional boundaries. Eyewitness accounts describe attackers using equipment inconsistent with either federal or coalition standard issue. Multiple sources report communications intercepts containing terminology and protocols absent from known military frameworks. Technical analysis of explosive residue from 3 separate incidents reveals components not included in either faction's arsenal, but matching proprietary formulations from Shinra Group's military contracting division. Most concerning are financial records showing Shinra Group subsidiaries securing emergency reconstruction contracts for damaged infrastructure within hours of attacks, in some cases before incidents were publicly reported. Their Secure Regions initiative now manages recovery operations for critical facilities across all 3 territories, despite fundamental differences in governance systems. These contracts establish unprecedented private authority over essential services previously managed through public or military frameworks, regardless of factional control. We've established secure drop procedures for anyone with information regarding these operations or Shinra Group involvement. Access our emergency communication protocol through frequency 121.77 at midnight using standard encryption. Authenticate with the phrase, "The truth divides only those who fear it." Your safety remains our primary concern. Follow all operational security measures without exception. This concludes today's emergency broadcast. We will transmit again when security protocols permit. Remember that factional division serves interests beyond those fighting this conflict. Look beneath official narratives regardless of their alignment with your previous beliefs. This is Marion Crane for the Independent Journalist Network. Stay safe, stay vigilant, stay connected to truth regardless of its source.
Test signal alpha. If you're receiving this transmission, the frequency remains secure for now. Previous broadcast attempts have been jammed or traced to source. They're getting better at finding us. They're getting better at silencing anyone connecting the pieces. But the truth keeps leaking through the cracks despite their technological advantages and unlimited resources. I've been called paranoid for years. Conspiracy theorist. Fringe lunatic. But I've spent a decade tracking the same patterns, now becoming visible to everyone with eyes still capable of seeing beyond manufactured narratives. The coordinated attacks on independent media 9 days ago weren't random. They weren't factional strategy. They were the elimination of the last information sources capable of exposing what's really happening beneath this conflict. I've acquired significant documentation. Not complete, not yet public, but substantial enough to confirm what many have suspected. The Shinra Group isn't merely profiting from this conflict. They engineered it from conception through current execution. The assassination of Barrett Strife that triggered initial unrest, the footage showing different perpetrators depending on which faction's media you consumed, the algorithmic amplification of outrage ensuring peaceful protest escalated to violence, all implemented through Shinra subsidiaries operating behind corporate facades and security contracts. The evidence trail remains fragmentary but increasingly coherent. Financial records show Shinra's Strategic Investment Division establishing substantial positions in military contracting, infrastructure reconstruction, and emergency management services 18 months before Barrett Strife's assassination. Their digital solutions subsidiary secured contracts for information infrastructure with both federal and coalition authorities 16 months before conflict erupted. Their security operations group hired thousands of private military contractors with specialized urban warfare experience 14 months before the first cities experienced fighting. Most damning are internal strategy documents I've obtained from 3 separate sources within Shinra's corporate structure. These materials outline what they called Operation Permanent Majority, a comprehensive framework for engineering social division, institutional collapse, and infrastructure degradation, creating optimal conditions for private acquisition of governance functions. The documents explicitly discuss manipulating existing political divisions to trigger armed conflict while positioning corporate interests to control reconstruction regardless which faction nominally prevailed. I don't have everything yet. I need time to organize the evidence, authenticate additional documents, and establish secure distribution networks beyond their jamming capability. What I currently possess would be insufficient against their sophisticated disinformation systems and control of remaining media channels. They would discredit partial evidence before complete documentation could establish the comprehensive pattern. I need to finish assembling the complete framework before public release. For those receiving this transmission, 3 critical tasks. First, document everything occurring in your location. Infrastructure failures, military operations, private security presence, resource distribution changes. Second, preserve any communications from Shinra Group subsidiaries regarding security contracts, reconstruction services, or emergency management. Third, establish secure information networks independent of remaining infrastructure, analog methods resistant to digital monitoring and algorithmic manipulation. The coordinated insurgent operations now spreading through all territories represent the conflict's next manufactured phase. These attacks damage infrastructure with highest post-conflict value while creating conditions requiring private security intervention. They're designed not for military advantage, but for comprehensive transfer of essential services to private control without democratic oversight or factional accountability. The apparent chaos follows a precisely engineered pattern serving corporate acquisition rather than political objectives. I've established secure dead drops in 7 locations across territorial boundaries. Access protocols available through...
Signal terminated. Triangulation complete. Security assets dispatched to coordinates. Information containment protocol initiated. Witnesses scheduled for processing. Shinra Group thanks you for your cooperation.
This is the National Emergency Broadcast System, operating on reserved frequency 162.55 MHz. Standard telecommunications infrastructure remains inoperative across 83% of continental territory. Emergency transmitters maintain limited function through independent power systems. The following program represents authorized emergency information exchange between territorial authorities. Reception is permitted under Emergency Communications Protocol.
Good evening, fellow Americans, wherever and however you're receiving this transmission. I'm John Parker, broadcasting from the Central Alliance Emergency Communications Center in Denver, Colorado. 10 weeks into America's internal conflict, we face what technical experts describe as comprehensive telecommunications collapse. the failure of communication infrastructure across all territories, regardless of political control or military status. Current assessment indicates approximately 83% of pre-conflict telecommunications capacity inoperative. Cellular networks function only in isolated pockets with severely restricted range. Internet connectivity remains available in less than 7% of continental territory. Landline telephone systems operate exclusively within local exchanges, unable to connect across regional boundaries. This emergency broadcast represents unprecedented cooperation between factions despite ongoing conflict. Through alliance mediation, both federal and coalition authorities have agreed to limited information exchange regarding the telecommunications collapse affecting all territories. This temporary channel does not represent diplomatic recognition or conflict resolution, but practical necessity addressing shared technical crisis transcending political division. We're joined by representatives from both primary factions to discuss technical assessment and response strategies. From Federal Territory, Thomas Doyle, Military Communications Liaison for Eastern Command. From Coalition Territory, Roger Thornhill, Field Operations Coordinator for Midwestern Region. Both representatives speak with authorization from their respective authorities while maintaining operational security regarding sensitive information. Gentlemen, thank you for participating in this unprecedented exchange. What is currently known about the cause and extent of this telecommunications collapse affecting all territories, regardless of factional control?
This represents nothing less than sabotage of critical national infrastructure by insurgent forces, Mr. Parker. Federal technical assessment confirms coordinated attacks against key telecommunications nodes throughout eastern and central regions. Our security forces have documented multiple incidents of physical sabotage targeting fiber optic junction facilities, cellular transmission infrastructure, and satellite uplink installations. These operations demonstrate sophisticated technical knowledge and operational coordination consistent with coalition special operations capabilities rather than civilian insurgents, as their propaganda suggests. The pattern clearly indicates deliberate effort to degrade federal communications capacity rather than technical failure or collateral damage from conventional operations. The targeting prioritization demonstrates comprehensive understanding of our network architecture that could only derive from pre-conflict intelligence sources or active insider threat. The precision of these operations suggests direct coalition military involvement despite their continued denials and attempts to shift responsibility.
That's complete disinformation from a regime desperate to conceal its own failures, Mr. Parker. Coalition technical assessment confirmed electromagnetic warfare operations originating from federal territory, targeting communications infrastructure throughout liberated regions. Our electronic defense systems have documented sophisticated jamming patterns, destructive signal intrusion, and remote infrastructure manipulation consistent with federal cyber warfare capabilities, rather than conventional military operations as their propaganda suggests. The evidence clearly demonstrates deliberate federal strategy to deny basic communication capabilities to civilian populations in coalition territories rather than legitimate military objectives or operational necessity. These electronic attacks specifically target civilian service coordination, emergency response systems, and community information networks rather than military command infrastructure. The operation patterns reflect federal doctrine emphasizing civilian hardship as pressure mechanism rather than conventional electronic warfare targeting military capabilities.
Gentlemen, with respect, both explanations fail to address the fundamental pattern. Telecommunications infrastructure has collapsed symmetrically across all territories, regardless of factional control. Neither explanation accounts for identical failure patterns in regions dominated by opposing forces, as well as neutral territories. Could we focus specifically on this symmetrical aspect that suggests causation beyond factional operations?
The symmetrical appearance merely reflects coalition propaganda attempting to obscure their responsibility, Mr. Parker. Federal territories experience targeted infrastructure attacks while maintaining significant backup capabilities through hardened military networks developed precisely for contingency operations. The apparent symmetry represents deliberate narrative manipulation rather than technical reality. Our civilian populations maintain access to emergency communications through federal emergency management systems designed for precisely this scenario.
That's rich coming from a regime that dismantled civilian emergency systems to prioritize military communications, Mr. Parker. The federal territories experience infrastructure collapse because their centralized architecture creates vulnerability despite supposed contingency planning. Coalition communities maintain functional local networks through distributed architecture and community-based technical innovation. The supposed symmetry represents federal narrative manipulation attempting to create false equivalence between their catastrophic governance failures and our adaptive community resilience.
Technical experts from the Alliance Communications Assessment Team have documented nearly identical failure patterns in specific infrastructure components across all territorial boundaries. Their analysis indicates failure of identical equipment types regardless of location or factional control. Could either of you address this technical assessment that transcends political narratives?
Alliance technical experts lack access to classified federal assessment capabilities, Mr. Parker. Their analysis represents superficial pattern recognition without comprehensive understanding of underlying network architecture or security protocols. The supposed identical failures merely reflect common vulnerability exploitation rather than equivalent causation. This represents established factual pattern rather than political narrative, despite your attempt to characterize legitimate security assessment as mere partisan positioning.
Alliance analysis suffers from neutrality bias, creating false equivalence between aggressor and defender, Mr. Parker. Their technical teams document symptoms while deliberately avoiding attribution that would acknowledge federal responsibility. The supposed identical failures merely demonstrate consistent federal electronic warfare signature rather than mysterious third-party causation. This represents established factual pattern rather than political narrative, despite your attempt to characterize legitimate technical assessment as mere partisan positioning.
Our technical team has identified consistent equipment failure signatures across all territorial boundaries that match neither documented federal electronic warfare patterns nor confirmed coalition sabotage methodologies. Multiple independent analyses indicate potential third-party technical signatures. Would either of you address the possibility that both factions face interference from entities operating beyond established military frameworks?
This represents classic both sides disinformation designed to obscure clear responsibility, Mr. Parker. The technical evidence conclusively demonstrates coalition responsibility regardless of alliance, reluctance to acknowledge factional accountability. Federal intelligence has confirmed multiple technology transfers from hostile foreign powers to coalition forces, precisely matching the sabotage methodologies now deployed against civilian infrastructure. These facts remain unchanged regardless of rhetorical attempts to distribute responsibility beyond those directly implementing these attacks.
The Alliance continues demonstrating fundamental misunderstanding of asymmetric warfare realities, Mr. Parker. The technical evidence conclusively establishes federal responsibility regardless of Alliance commitment to artificial neutrality. Coalition intelligence has confirmed multiple technology transfers from Shinra Group subsidiaries to federal forces, precisely matching the attack methodologies now deployed against civilian networks. These facts remain unchanged regardless of diplomatic attempts to dilute responsibility through vague conspiracy frameworks.
As our limited broadcast window closes, I'd like to offer each representative opportunity for a brief closing statement regarding potential cooperation on telecommunications restoration despite ongoing conflict. Mr. Doyle, your final thoughts.
Federal authorities maintain absolute commitment to civilian welfare throughout all American territories, regardless of temporary insurgent occupation. Mr. Parker, our technical teams stand ready to restore essential communications infrastructure whenever coalition forces cease their sabotage operations and accept legitimate constitutional authority. Federal authorities remain the sole legitimate representatives of United States continuity, regardless of temporary territorial fragmentation or insurgent propaganda. This fundamental reality cannot be negotiated, compromised, or obscured through artificial equivalence, regardless of diplomatic convenience.
Coalition authorities maintain absolute commitment to constitutional principles throughout all American territories, regardless of temporary regime occupation. Mr. Parker, our community networks stand ready to establish genuine information freedom whenever federal forces cease their electronic warfare operations and accept legitimate constitutional limitations. Coalition authorities represent legitimate constitutional governance, regardless of regime propaganda or international diplomatic convenience. This fundamental principle cannot be compromised, negotiated, or abandoned through artificial equivalence, regardless of temporary practical considerations.
Thank you both for participating in this unprecedented exchange despite profound disagreements. While consensus remains elusive, this communication itself represents potential framework for addressing technical challenges transcending political division. Alliance communications assessment teams remain available to both factions for technical support without political conditions or recognition requirements. For civilians receiving this transmission, local adaptation remains essential regardless of territorial location. Establish community communication networks using available technology. Create regular information exchange schedules through designated representatives. Prioritize emergency coordination, resource sharing, and family reunification over political alignment. The human need for connection transcends artificial boundaries regardless of legitimate governance disagreements.
This concludes our emergency broadcast window. Future transmissions will occur on this frequency at 0800 and 2000 hours as equipment and security conditions permit. This is John Parker for the Central Alliance Emergency Communications Network. Stay safe, stay connected, stay human beneath the divisions this conflict has imposed.
This is an emergency transmission on backup frequency 1.775 megahertz. Standard communications remain down across 83% of the country. This broadcast uses independent power systems. If you can hear me, you're among the few Americans with working reception equipment during what people are calling the Great Blackout. I'm Vincent Valentine, broadcasting through emergency systems as this unprecedented communications collapse enters its second week. Tonight we're connecting with people who found ways to communicate despite this massive blackout. Our emergency frequency shifts hourly according to the pattern shared through the analog network. Linda from Ohio, you're on Late Night America.
I'm with an emergency response team in northeastern Ohio. The strangest thing about this blackout is how it's affected systems that should have stayed operational. Even military communications with backup power and hardened shielding have failed alongside regular networks. We've set up an old-school communication system using ham radios and bicycle messengers. The human impact has been immediate and severe. Hospitals can't coordinate patient transfers. Water treatment facilities can't sync their operations. Food distribution centers can't track inventory or deliveries. Most concerning are the medical consequences. People with chronic conditions can't reach their doctors when complications arise. Emergency responders can't coordinate effectively. Patients needing dialysis or other regular treatments can't find out which facilities are operational.
Michael from West Virginia, you're on Late Night America.
I work with a civilian coordination group tracking how different communities are responding to the blackout. Both federal and coalition territories are implementing similar emergency measures: mandatory registration of functioning communication equipment, centralized information distribution, restricted movement between districts. For ordinary people, the impact depends largely on where you live. Urban centers have more resources but greater dependency on complex systems. Rural areas have fewer resources but more self-sufficiency. The hardest hit are suburban communities that lack both urban infrastructure and rural resilience. What's alarming is how quickly information environments have fragmented. Communities just miles apart have completely different understandings of what's happening based on whatever limited information trickles in. Some areas believe the blackout is a coalition attack, others think it's federal sabotage, while some see it as natural infrastructure collapse. The most revealing pattern is who gets prioritized for remaining resources. In both federal and coalition territories, communities near military or strategic assets receive faster emergency response. Civilian needs are increasingly categorized by strategic value rather than humanitarian urgency.
As we conclude tonight's emergency broadcast, these reports from across the blackout zone reveal a critical truth. When advanced technology fails, human connection finds simpler, more resilient pathways. The communications collapse has created tremendous hardship, but it's also dismantling the information barriers that maintained artificial division. Communities are rediscovering direct democracy through neighborhood councils and mutual aid networks. People are recognizing shared vulnerabilities that transcend political affiliations. Medical professionals, farmers, engineers, and ordinary citizens are self-organizing to meet basic needs when centralized systems collapse. This is Vincent Valentine reminding you that darkness often reveals what remained hidden during normal times, our fundamental interdependence beyond artificial divisions. In darkness, even small lights become beacons. Good night, America, wherever and however you're hearing this.
The following address from President Sam Loomis has been authorized for mandatory broadcast on all functioning communication systems throughout federal territories.
My wonderful Americans, we're facing tremendous challenges to our unity and security. This telecommunications collapse, the most vicious attack on American civilians in history. These insurgents don't care about humanitarian principles despite all their Constitution talk. Our federal authorities, amazing people, the best, have confirmed this infrastructure collapse was caused by coalition forces targeting civilian communications, not military systems. It's like that villain in The Dark Knight who just wanted chaos. This is a deliberate attack against civilians, folks, not collateral damage, not an accident. Despite these challenges, our emergency response is fully operational. Like the Death Star in Star Wars, except we're the good guys. We've implemented alternative communication networks, the best networks for all registered civilians. I'm invoking emergency authorities under Presidential Directive 17. Very powerful stuff. Federal communications restoration teams will implement mandatory protocols throughout all territories, even insurgent-occupied areas. All communications equipment now falls under federal management, and technical personnel must register immediately. It's going to be amazing. These measures show our commitment to restoring services, not authoritarian impulses like the fake insurgent propaganda claims. The measures are temporary only until we restore critical infrastructure. To Americans in insurgent territories, we recognize you as citizens. The insurgents created these communication problems to isolate you from the truth, like in The Truman Show. Federal teams will establish emergency access throughout all territories despite interference. For those considering supporting insurgents, we know the difference between willing sabotage and forced compliance. Voluntary participants face severe consequences, but those forced to help will find understanding through our reconciliation programs. Throughout history, we've faced challenges that tested our unity. Remember Independence Day. When aliens attacked, everybody came together. That's what we need. Federal authorities are determined to restore legitimate governance throughout all American territories. These restoration efforts aren't just repairs, they're about reconnecting our great nation. Through these emergency systems, Americans everywhere will get access to accurate information and human connection. We're going to win this thing, and we're going to win it big. God bless America.
This concludes the presidential address. Tampering with federal emergency communications equipment violates Security Directive 23B, subject to immediate enforcement action. Report unauthorized broadcast activities to local Federal Communications Compliance Office.
My brothers and sisters in Christ, I speak to you today through whatever means the Lord provides as darkness falls across our troubled land. Not merely the physical darkness of night, but the deeper shadow that comes when human voices can no longer reach one another. When the connections between communities, families, and neighbors become severed not by distance but by deliberate design. When those who would rule through division ensure we cannot hear each other's cries, comfort, or common humanity across artificial boundaries they have erected between us. The scripture teaches us in Genesis about mankind's first great technological endeavor, the Tower of Babel. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." The tower builders sought to reach heaven through their own achievement rather than divine grace. Their punishment was not destruction but division, the confusion of languages that prevented their continued cooperation despite physical proximity. Today we witness not divine intervention but human recreation of this ancient division. Those who seek power without accountability, wealth without contribution, and control without consent have deliberately confused our languages once again. They have constructed not a physical tower but invisible barriers, ensuring Americans can no longer hear each other across political, ideological, and now physical divisions. The telecommunications collapse represents not technical failure but deliberate amputation of our collective voice, ensuring communities cannot share experiences that might reveal their common exploitation beneath superficial differences. Yet even in this manufactured darkness, light continues to spread through methods the powerful cannot anticipate or control. Throughout history, when official channels become corrupted or collapse, the human voice finds new pathways. During Roman persecution, early Christians developed symbolic languages invisible to authorities. During slavery, spirituals carried coded messages beneath their apparent meanings. During occupation, resistance networks established communication systems beyond official monitoring. In each case, human connection transcended artificial barriers through creativity, courage, and commitment to truth beyond official narratives. I have traveled extensively throughout territories claimed by all factions in recent weeks. What I've witnessed gives me profound hope despite superficial appearances of division. In federal territories, civilians establish unauthorized information networks despite registration requirements and content restrictions. In coalition regions, communities maintain connections with neighboring areas regardless of territorial boundaries. In alliance zones, citizens create reconciliation frameworks that transcend factional identification. These grassroots connections represent not coordinated resistance but natural human rejection of artificial separation regardless of its source or justification. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face." This current darkness, this deliberate obscuring of our view of one another, represents temporary condition rather than permanent separation. When communications fail, human messengers emerge. When digital connections collapse, physical networks develop. When factional narratives attempt to demonize fellow Americans, direct human experience reveals their common humanity beyond manufactured divisions. I close with words from Isaiah that speak directly to our current circumstances. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. This prophecy reminds us that darkness, whether natural or manufactured, represents temporary condition rather than permanent state. The light continues shining regardless of attempts to obscure it. The human connection continues developing regardless of systems designed to prevent it. The truth continues spreading regardless of narratives created to conceal it. May God bless and protect you wherever you hear these words. May He guide your steps through this temporary darkness toward renewed connection with your fellow Americans. May He grant you wisdom to recognize manipulation regardless of its source or justification. And may He strengthen your commitment to human dignity that transcends all artificial boundaries this conflict has temporarily imposed between His children. Amen.
The following broadcast originates from the Central Alliance Emergency Network. Due to ongoing communication disruptions, signal quality may vary.
Good evening. I'm John Parker reporting from Denver. 13 weeks into this conflict, we're witnessing an alarming escalation following the telecommunications blackout. Military engagements have intensified across multiple regions as both federal and coalition forces exploit the communication vulnerabilities. The death toll from the past week alone has reached an estimated 3,800, with civilian casualties now making up nearly 60% of that figure. Infrastructure damage has left over 20 major cities without reliable power or water. Refugee movements now exceed 300,000 people weekly as communities flee expanding combat zones. We go now to field correspondent Kyle Reese on the outskirts of St. Louis, where some of the heaviest fighting has occurred. Kyle, what are you seeing there?
John, I'm about 3 miles west of downtown St. Louis, where it's been block-by-block urban combat since the telecom collapse. What we're seeing here mirrors cities nationwide, a breakdown of coordinated command leading to fragmented operations with minimal central control. From my position, I can see federal airstrikes hitting what coalition sources claim are civilian areas, while coalition artillery pounds federal supply routes from positions in residential neighborhoods. Neither side can maintain secure communications with their units, resulting in increasingly autonomous operations with little strategic coordination. The human cost is devastating. St. Louis University Medical Center reports over 700 civilian casualties in just 48 hours, with medical supplies exhausted and no evacuation routes for the wounded. I spoke with Dr. Sarah Coleman at a makeshift hospital this morning, who told me conditions were worse than any combat zone I served in overseas because there's no secure area to evacuate patients.
We received statements from both commands regarding the escalation. Federal authorities claim they're conducting precision defensive measures against coordinated insurgent sabotage. Coalition leadership describes their actions as necessary countermeasures against deliberate federal attacks on civilian networks. From your perspective, Kyle, how do these official narratives match what you're seeing?
There's a stark disconnect between statements and reality, John. Both sides claim defensive positioning, while I've directly observed offensive operations targeting clearly non-military infrastructure. Federal strikes yesterday destroyed cellular towers and an internet exchange with no coalition presence. Coalition forces simultaneously targeted power nodes in federal districts with no tactical advantage. Neither side seems to have accurate intelligence following the communication failures.
I spoke with a federal captain who admitted his unit hadn't received authenticated orders in over 72 hours and was making tactical decisions based on local assessment rather than strategic objectives.
What's clear is that neither side anticipated the cascading effects of targeting telecommunications. The infrastructure interdependencies mean attacks against communication nodes have disrupted power, water, hospitals, and transportation far beyond the intended targets. These unplanned consequences have generated casualties that neither faction appears to have strategically intended. I need to move immediately, John. Federal drones have been spotted in this sector, and civilian lookouts are warning about incoming artillery. We'll try to reconnect when we've reached cover. This is Kyle Reese in St. Louis. Back to you.
Thank you, Kyle. Please stay safe. We'll keep your slot open for when you can safely resume. While we wait for Kyle, these patterns are emerging across all conflict zones following the telecom disruptions. Alliance monitors report similar fighting in 17 major cities, including Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, and Pittsburgh. The common elements include fragmented command structures, rising civilian casualties, and spontaneous community networks forming beneath the factional combat. Particularly concerning is the shift in casualty patterns. Civilian deaths now exceed military casualties by 3 to 1, a significant change from earlier phases when combat deaths predominated. This correlates directly with the telecom failures, suggesting reduced targeting precision and compromised warning systems. We're getting word that Kyle has reached a secure location. Kyle, are you there?
I'm here, John, broadcasting from a civilian shelter about 2 miles from our previous position. The area we were in took heavy artillery minutes after we left, consistent with the pattern we've observed throughout this phase. Military units appear to be striking any location transmitting electronic signals, regardless of civilian or press designation. This shelter represents exactly the kind of cross-factional cooperation I mentioned earlier. It was established by community members from both federal and coalition neighborhoods, operating completely independently from either authority. They maintain an early warning network using entirely analog methods, lookouts with mirror signals, and colored flags to communicate approaching military units. I'm joined by Michael Davis, one of the shelter coordinators. Mr. Davis, how does this operation function without official support?
When the networks went down, we realized nobody was coming to help us. Federal authorities focused on their command infrastructure and coalition forces concentrated on military objectives. Regular folks were on our own, so we organized block by block. We identified secure basements, cataloged resources, and established communication using methods that couldn't be disrupted electronically. What surprised us was how quickly people from opposite sides started working together. I supported the federal government while my coordinator, Sarah, was a strong coalition advocate. None of that matters when you're pulling children from rubble or treating wounds without anesthesia. We prohibited political discussion in exchange for security and resource access. People complied because survival depends on cooperation, not factional loyalty. Our biggest challenge is medical supplies. We run 15 micro-hospitals with volunteer staff, but pharmaceuticals are critically low. We've established trade networks with similar community groups in neighboring districts, exchanging our surplus food for their excess medical materials. These arrangements operate outside official channels, but have become essential as factional supply chains collapse.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Back to you, John.
This pattern mirrors reports from across contested territories, with civilian self-organization emerging as the most effective response to the conflict. Alliance coordinators document similar community networks in 27 major cities, operating largely independent of any faction. What's significant is how these civilian adaptations transcend previous factional identity. Communities that define themselves through federal or coalition affiliation now organize based purely on practical necessity. This suggests the conflict's ideological foundations may be weaker than factional rhetoric indicates, with ordinary Americans prioritizing mutual survival over abstract governance claims when infrastructure collapse forces direct cooperation. Our broadcast window is closing as emergency power reserves run low. We'll resume at 0800 tomorrow on rotating emergency frequencies. For civilians receiving this transmission, Alliance humanitarian coordination continues through designated contact points despite communication disruptions. Community self-organization remains the most effective survival strategy as conflict intensifies following the telecom failures. This is John Parker for the Central Alliance Emergency Network. Stay safe, stay connected through whatever means available. And remember that our shared humanity transcends the artificial boundaries this conflict attempts to impose.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Straight Talk Underground. I'm your host Joel Miller, coming to you from, well, somewhere they haven't found me yet. Quick security reminder, don't stream this on any watch network, use headphones and delete it after listening. Our safety depends on your carefulness. What I'm about to share might be the most important thing we've ever aired. After months of digging, we've got solid proof that this entire war was engineered from the start. This isn't conspiracy stuff or my opinion. It's hard facts backed by corporate records, money transfers, internal memos, and recorded meetings. With me today are two people who helped uncover all this. Marion Crane, investigative reporter who's been working underground since the attacks that killed John Connor and his team. And Guy Haynes, a data analyst and whistleblower who's been tracking Shinra Group for years. Thanks for joining me, both of you.
Thanks, Joe. We need to get this evidence to as many Americans as possible before it's too late. What we found completely changes everything about this conflict and who's really benefiting from our division.
After being called paranoid for years, I wish I could feel vindicated, but the scale of this is just horrifying, Joel. The documents we've gathered prove beyond doubt that this entire war was planned and executed by corporate interests who are making billions from American suffering.
I want to be clear about how we verified all this. We've authenticated these documents through multiple methods and sources. Every financial record has been verified through separate banking channels. Every recording has been voice matched. This is the real deal, the most solid evidence I've seen in 20 years of journalism. Marion, what exactly are we looking at here?
The evidence shows that Shinra Group, this massive corporation with over 130 subsidiaries in military contracting, infrastructure, communications, and banking, deliberately engineered this entire conflict to pull off the biggest corporate takeover of public services in history. This wasn't them just profiting from a crisis. They created the crisis according to a detailed plan. Their internal documents call it Operation Permanent Majority. A step-by-step playbook to transform America through manufactured crisis. First, they manipulated information to amplify existing divisions. Then they systematically undermined trust in government. Finally, they prepared trigger events to push social division into actual conflict, including Barrett Strife's assassination that started everything. All these communications blackouts, infrastructure failures, and resource shortages we've been experiencing, they're not random consequences of fighting. They're the deliberate implementation of a corporate plan. They literally mapped out how territorial fragmentation, government division, and infrastructure collapse would create perfect conditions for them to take over essential systems without oversight or competition.
Guy, you've studied Shinra structure for years. When did they start planning all this?
The earliest documents we have go back about 5 years before Barrett Strife was killed, Joel. That's when Shinra started studying how they might evolve governance relationships, corporate speak for taking control of public functions. About 3 years before the assassination, they shifted from theory to action. They started buying up companies that provide essential services across what would become divided territories. Water systems, power companies, medical services, food distribution networks. They positioned themselves to control the basics of survival, no matter which side won the conflict. Most telling was how they set up parallel divisions specifically designed for different types of government. Their internal documents explicitly discuss creating governance-specific implementation frameworks that would let them operate simultaneously under potentially competing authority structures. In plain English, they built a corporate structure designed to thrive during a civil war they were planning to start.
Let's talk about Barrett Strife's assassination, the event that triggered everything. Marion, what have you found about Shinra's involvement?
The evidence is chilling, Joe. Shinra's internal communications discuss what they called catalyst event implementation. Scheduled for the exact date, Strife was killed. They had detailed operational plans, resource assignments, and even post-event assessment protocols, describing how to manage the narrative trajectory afterward. We have financial records showing Shinra subsidiary payments to security personnel who were later identified at the assassination site. These people got large money transfers through shell companies 2 days before it happened and bonus payments 3 days after. The payment structure matches Shinra's standard protocols for what they call deniable asset operations. What's most damning is what happened right after the shooting. Shinra's media companies immediately implemented pre-programmed narrative divergence protocols across their platforms. These systems generated contradictory evidence supporting multiple explanations depending on the audience's political leanings. This started just 4 minutes after the assassination. Way too fast to be spontaneous and exactly matching the timeline and planning documents created weeks earlier.
We've obtained a recording that proves what no one was meant to discover. This captures a meeting between Shinra executive Albert Wesker, Federal President Sam Loomis, and Coalition Chair Jeff Jeffries. The conversation happened at Shinra's Secure Island facility and was captured by their internal monitoring system, later extracted by one of our whistleblowers.
Gentlemen, another successful quarter of managed conflict. The resource acquisition projections have exceeded even our optimistic models. Both your performance metrics are tracking exactly as outlined in our original agreement.
The tyrannical federal overreach narrative is working beautifully on your end, Jeff. My Security Council was genuinely impressed with how quickly your militia units withdrew from the Minneapolis engagement just before our airstrike arrived at the empty target. The drone footage gave us excellent propaganda material without a single actual casualty.
Your ruthless suppression routine isn't bad either, Sam. That speech about crushing the insurgency had my commanders convinced we were actually under threat. Meanwhile, my coalition gets to play the revolutionary freedom fighters while Shinra quietly doubles infrastructure fees in our territories.
The beauty of this arrangement is its perfect alignment of interests. Mr. Loomis, your federal administration receives expanded emergency powers, military funding, and public compliance through fear. Mr. Jeffries, your coalition gains popular support, regional autonomy, and heroic status through resistance. And Shinra Corporation acquires infrastructure, service contracts, and governance authority previously impossible under peacetime regulatory constraints.
The casualty management has been particularly impressive. The precision of our accidentally missed targets and your carefully staged attacks has kept civilian deaths at just the right level, enough to maintain public outrage, but not enough to trigger international intervention.
That building collapse in Chicago was masterful. My propaganda team got 3 weeks of content from it, and the reconstruction contracts to Shinra subsidiaries are worth billions. The public has no idea we evacuated everyone 8 hours before the surprise attack.
Timing is becoming critical as we approach Phase 4. Our models project optimal conditions for the unity government transition in approximately 4 months. Public exhaustion metrics are reaching threshold levels in both territories. Resource scarcity has been calibrated to maximum tolerance without triggering uncontrolled resistance.
My resignation speech is already drafted. The reluctant transfer of power to restore national unity plays well with focus groups. I assume my compensation package for the post-presidency corporate board positions remains as discussed.
5 board seats, 3 offshore accounts in the Wyoming compound, all untraceable through our subsidiary network as promised.
And my negotiated surrender for the good of the people is scheduled for the week after. The heroic resistance leader who ultimately chooses peace over pride.
With corresponding advisory positions in the Montana property, correct. Gentlemen, what we've accomplished is unprecedented in modern governance. The controlled demolition of a democratic system with the willing participation of its elected leadership. The public will never know they've witnessed the most profitable corporate acquisition in history disguised as a civil conflict.
What about the journalists? This Connor fellow and his network have been asking uncomfortable questions about the symmetrical infrastructure damage patterns.
Already scheduled for removal. Both your military units will simultaneously target independent media facilities under the pretext of preventing enemy propaganda and eliminating federal misinformation. The remaining channels will be limited to our approved narrative distribution.
To the Second Republic. May the public never realize the first one never actually fell. It was simply sold to the highest bidder.
That recording exposes the complete facade of this conflict. The fighting, the political rhetoric, the territorial disputes, all carefully orchestrated theater, while Shinra acquires control of American infrastructure and governance. But the manipulation goes even deeper than this staged leadership conflict. Guy, what have you found about how they're controlling the actual combat operations?
They've engineered what military experts would call strategic stalemate, deliberately ensuring neither side can win while maximizing infrastructure damage that requires private rebuilding. Shinra subsidiaries have contracts with both federal and coalition forces for critical military functions, including communications, logistics, intelligence, and security. Their internal documents describe performance optimization protocols applied to military technology on both sides. In plain English, they've rigged the equipment. Surveillance systems given to federal forces have blind spots that prevent detecting certain coalition operations. Targeting systems provided to coalition forces have limitations, making them less effective against specific federal assets. Both sides' communications have what engineers called managed reliability parameters, deliberate weak points that can be activated during critical operations. The most disturbing evidence shows what Shinra calls conflict equilibrium maintenance, their efforts to ensure the war stays deadlocked. Whenever federal forces get close to a breakthrough, their communications and supply systems mysteriously fail. When coalition forces gain advantage, their command networks suddenly develop technical problems. These aren't random failures. They're deliberate interventions designed to extend the conflict and increase infrastructure damage that Shinra will profit from rebuilding.
Marion, how is Shinra profiting financially from all this?
They've implemented what economists call disaster capitalism on an unprecedented scale. Joel, positioning themselves to profit enormously from a crisis they created while acquiring essential infrastructure at fire sale prices. Their strategy works on 3 levels. First, they have conflict service contracts with both federal and coalition governments for essential functions: communications, logistics, security, intelligence. Second, they're buying up critical infrastructure in conflict zones: water systems, power plants, transportation networks at pennies on the dollar. Third, they position themselves as the only option for rebuilding essential services once the fighting stops. Their financial models explicitly calculated the optimal conflict duration for maximum profit. Their projections show 18 to 24 months as the sweet spot, long enough to maximize infrastructure acquisition, but ending before complete collapse would prevent profitable rebuilding. The most disturbing part is what they call their governance arbitrage strategy, exploiting the chaos to bypass regulations and competition. With governments fractured, Shinra has secured emergency contracts exempt from normal procurement rules, established exclusive service agreements without competitive bidding, and acquired public infrastructure without standard oversight or proper valuation.
Guy, how have they managed the information environment to keep people from figuring this out?
They've implemented what amounts to mass psychological manipulation through digital systems that shape how Americans perceive reality. Shinra's tech companies deployed what internal documents call perception management frameworks designed to deepen social division and prevent people from recognizing the corporate manipulation. Their strategy works in 3 ways. First, they modified content recommendation systems to push divisive material while hiding moderate perspectives. Second, they deployed fake accounts to create the appearance of widespread support for extreme positions. Third, they used sophisticated psychological profiling to identify individual vulnerabilities for personalized manipulation. Their systems created what engineers called cognitive separation architecture, parallel information ecosystems that prevent shared understanding of basic facts. People with different political leanings were systematically shown entirely different versions of the same events. Even the language evolved differently in separated communities, making meaningful communication nearly impossible. Emotional triggers were refined through constant testing to maximize reaction and minimize reflection.
Marion, what does all this evidence show about their long-term plan?
The documents reveal their ultimate goal: to shift effective governance power from democratic institutions to private corporate structures without triggering public resistance. Shinra has implemented what their internal documents call authority migration frameworks, designed to maintain the appearance of democracy while transferring actual decision-making power to corporate entities. Their planning outlines what they call Phase 5, strategic consolidation, establishing a unity government that combines elements from all three governance systems while embedding unprecedented corporate control throughout essential functions. This isn't about reconciliation between divided Americans. It's the culmination of their strategy to transform governance while keeping the illusion of democracy. Their timeline has accelerated since they eliminated independent media and collapsed telecommunications. The current situation of factional stalemate, increasing civilian hardship, and infrastructure breakdown creates perfect conditions for introducing their unity framework as the apparent solution to a crisis they manufactured.
We've presented solid evidence showing how Shinra deliberately engineered this entire conflict, from Barrett Strife's assassination through the current fighting and government breakdown. Their documents show systematic manipulation of information, security operations, economic conditions, and government structures, creating unprecedented opportunity for corporate takeover beyond democratic accountability. The most important thing for Americans across all territories to understand is that our division itself serves interests beyond the authorities supposedly controlling different regions. While federal, coalition, and alliance citizens focus on their apparent differences, they miss the consistent corporate takeover happening across all territories. While people argue about constitutional theories, Shinra systematically transfers essential services to private entities operating beyond any constitutional limits. The information we've shared today has been distributed through multiple secure channels throughout all territories. The complete documentation, over 40,000 corporate records, financial transactions, internal communications, and recorded conversations, has been secured in multiple locations beyond corporate or government reach. This evidence will continue spreading through decentralized networks no matter what they do to stop it. Americans across all territories face a fundamental choice: continue fighting each other while enabling corporate extraction, or recognize our shared exploitation and resist together. This choice becomes more critical each day as governance systems solidify and corporate integration deepens beyond the point of reversal. The window for recognition and coordinated response is closing as information becomes more fragmented and control systems become more integrated with essential resource access. This concludes our emergency broadcast. The underground network will continue transmission as security allows. Remember that our divisions serve interests beyond those supposedly controlling different territories. Look beneath the surface narratives regardless of which side you've been on. Recognize the human connection that transcends these artificial boundaries they've created to control us. This is Joel Miller with Marion Crane and Guy Haynes for The Underground. Stay vigilant. Stay connected.
Good evening. Extraordinary developments unfold across American territories following what observers describe as an information cascade event, the synchronized distribution of documents allegedly proving corporate orchestration of the entire American conflict Over the past 48 hours, coordinated civilian uprisings have erupted in major population centres across all governance territories, targeting both factional authorities and corporate facilities associated with the Shinra Group. What began as isolated protests has rapidly evolved into civilian occupation of government buildings and corporate headquarters throughout all regions, regardless of factional control. These actions demonstrate remarkable coordination despite severely degraded communications infrastructure, suggesting sophisticated planning beyond factional frameworks. What distinguishes these actions from previous protest movements is their explicit cross-factional cooperation. Civilian groups from supposedly opposing factions are engaging in synchronized actions against common targets rather than opposing each other. Their messaging explicitly references corporate manipulation of factional division, with identical slogans and demands appearing across previously hostile territories. This unprecedented unity suggests widespread recognition of shared exploitation rather than ideological alignment. The response from factional authorities shows significant fragmentation. Federal sources confirm President Loomis left the White House approximately 6 hours ago, destination unknown, following senior cabinet resignations and military command restructuring. Coalition headquarters in Oklahoma City report similar leadership disruption, with Jeff Jeffries and several key officials unaccounted for amid substantial security defections. Alliance governance demonstrates more stable transition, with Chancellor Sebastian addressing civilians directly and acknowledging legitimate grievances while calling for peaceful process. Corporate response reveals remarkable disarray despite previous demonstration of sophisticated operational capability. Shinra Group headquarters in Chicago has been completely surrounded by civilian groups, while security personnel increasingly abandon positions. Key executives, including CEO Albert Wesker, reportedly attempted helicopter evacuation from corporate headquarters, but were prevented from departure by coordinated civilian action. Satellite imagery confirms multiple corporate compounds experiencing document removal by civilian groups operating with apparent internal assistance from corporate employees, joining the recognition cascade. Emerging civilian governance structures appear to be forming across American territories. In major population centers, civilian coordination councils have formed with explicit cross-factional composition and transparent decision processes. These structures incorporate representatives from previously opposed groups working through consensus-based frameworks. Their operational focus prioritizes immediate humanitarian needs, essential service continuity, and documentation of corporate manipulation evidence. What distinguishes these emerging structures from previous governance frameworks is their explicit temporary nature and limited scope. Unlike federal coalition or even alliance authorities, these civilian councils explicitly define themselves as transitional bodies focused on essential function maintenance, corporate accountability, and preparation for democratic restoration rather than permanent governance establishment. The international community has responded with unprecedented unity. The United Nations Security Council has convened emergency sessions regarding the American crisis. The International Criminal Court has opened formal investigation into potential crimes against humanity related to deliberate engineering of conditions causing massive civilian casualties. Individual nations have implemented immediate measures targeting Shinra Group assets within their jurisdictions. For Global News Service, this is Richard Harrington in London. We'll continue monitoring these extraordinary developments as they unfold.
Good evening, fellow Americans. I'm Sarah Connor, broadcasting from the restored National Media Center in Chicago. For those who don't know me, I'm the daughter of John Connor, the journalist who, along with his team, was killed 6 weeks ago during the coordinated attacks on independent media facilities across all territories. My father dedicated his life to truth and integrity in journalism, particularly during this conflict when factional narratives increasingly replaced factual reporting. His final broadcast warned about corporate influence transcending factional boundaries, despite limited evidence available at that time. Today, I continue his work with both personal commitment to his legacy and professional dedication to the journalistic principles he exemplified. 72 weeks into what we now understand was a deliberately engineered American conflict, we witness extraordinary national transformation following the comprehensive exposure of Shinra Group documents 3 weeks ago. The underground disclosure, as historians are already calling the synchronized distribution of over 40,000 corporate documents across all territories, has fundamentally reframed understanding of this conflict's origins, progression, and purpose. Americans who believe themselves divided by unbridgeable ideological differences now recognize their shared exploitation by corporate interests that deliberately manufactured their division for financial gain. The immediate aftermath brought unprecedented civilian coordination across previously hostile territories. Populations that had been conditioned to view each other as enemies suddenly recognized their common victimization by sophisticated manipulation systems. Spontaneous civilian movements emerged simultaneously in major population centers throughout federal, coalition, and alliance territories, specifically targeting both factional leadership facilities and Shinra corporate installations. These actions demonstrated remarkable cross-factional cooperation despite severely degraded communications infrastructure, suggesting natural human connection, reasserting once deliberate separation mechanisms were exposed. Former factional leadership structures collapsed with extraordinary speed following document exposure. President Loomis fled the White House amid cabinet resignations and military command restructuring, currently awaiting trial for constitutional violations and criminal conspiracy. Coalition Chairman Jeffrey similarly abandoned headquarters as security forces defected, subsequently apprehended attempting to leave the country and now facing judicial proceedings. Alliance Chancellor Sebastian voluntarily stepped down while acknowledging structural complicity despite personal unawareness, currently serving as technical advisor to transition authorities. Corporate leadership experienced similar dissolution, with Shinra Group executives facing both domestic and international accountability processes. CEO Albert Wesker was detained attempting emergency evacuation from corporate headquarters and currently faces multiple charges, including crimes against humanity, criminal conspiracy, and financial violations. Dozens of additional executives from various Shinra subsidiaries remain in custody while evidence review continues and judicial proceedings advance. The most remarkable development has been the emergence of civilian coordination councils across all territories, establishing functional governance without factional division or corporate control. These councils incorporate representatives from previously opposed groups working through consensus-based frameworks. Their operational focus prioritizes immediate humanitarian needs, essential service continuity, and corporate accountability while explicitly acknowledging their temporary nature pending genuine democratic restoration. The National Transition Authority, established through Council Federation, now coordinates essential functions across all American territories while preparing for constitutional convention and eventual democratic elections. As we approach the conclusion of today's broadcast, I want to share a personal reflection on this extraordinary national journey and my father's role in maintaining independent journalism throughout its most challenging periods. John Connor represented commitment to truth despite overwhelming pressure from both factional narratives and corporate influence. His final broadcasts warned about patterns suggesting coordinated manipulation despite limited evidence available at that time. He paid the ultimate price for this commitment when independent media facilities were eliminated, precisely to prevent the recognition now spreading throughout American communities. What stands out to me most about this transition is how clearly it proves the old lessons my father taught me about journalism. No matter how advanced the systems built to hide the truth become, persistence and honest reporting still find a way through. Even when corporations pour resources into shaping the story, reality eventually breaks through once enough people see the evidence for themselves. It's a reminder that truth has its own kind of endurance. It bends under pressure, but it doesn't break. That belief carried independent journalism through its hardest times, and it still holds true today. Tomorrow evening, we will broadcast the interim president's address outlining the path toward constitutional restoration and democratic elections. Until then, this is Sarah Connor for the National Public Information Network, continuing the essential work of independent journalism my father championed throughout his life and ultimately died defending. From a nation rediscovering its unity beneath artificially imposed boundaries, good night, and may we continue recognizing our shared humanity despite sophisticated systems designed to obscure this fundamental connection. This is Sarah Connor reporting for the Independent American Network. Today, 6 months after the nationwide uprising that exposed the true architects of our national nightmare, we witnessed the peaceful transfer of power that once seemed impossible. From this national mall, still bearing scars of conflict, but healing like the nation itself, Titus Braska will soon take the oath as our first elected president since the war. The road to this day has been extraordinary. Interim councils maintained essential services while drafting constitutional reforms. Courts have brought the guilty to justice. And last month, Americans from every former territory cast their ballots in record numbers, choosing a path forward rooted in both tradition and hard-won wisdom. President-elect Braska, who lost family in the Chicago siege before helping organize the civilian response, campaigned not on division, but on a vision of governance that would never again allow Americans to be turned against each other. We now go live to the inauguration ceremony.
My fellow Americans, we gather on this hallowed ground not to celebrate victory, but to mark renewal. 6 months ago, we stood at the edge of an abyss. Brother fought brother. Our cities burned. Ancient hatred seemed to consume us. But then came truth, terrible and liberating, that the divisions tearing us apart had been manufactured for profit, that the hands guiding our destruction were neither federal nor coalition, but corporate manipulators who had weaponized our differences to engineer our downfall. Today, we reclaim our story. Look around you. To your left stands someone who once flew coalition colors. To your right, a former federal loyalist. Behind you, perhaps someone from the Alliance territories. Months ago, you were told these neighbors were your enemies. Today, they stand beside you as Americans. Nothing more, nothing less. The revelation of Shinra's systematic manipulation shocked our collective conscience. Their Operation Permanent Majority represented the most profound betrayal of American trust in our history. They assassinated Barrett Strife to trigger conflict. They controlled information to deepen our divisions. They damaged infrastructure to create dependency. They meticulously engineered a crisis designed to end with corporate control replacing constitutional governance. They failed. They failed because when Americans finally recognized their common exploitation, something remarkable happened. Artificial boundaries collapsed. Former enemies recognized their shared humanity. Citizens who had been manipulated into hatred stood shoulder to shoulder against those who had played them against each other. Our nation found its soul again. In dark hours, extraordinary heroes emerged. Journalists like John Connor, who gave his life pursuing truth when lies were profitable. Whistleblowers within Shinra, who risked everything to expose the conspiracy. Ordinary citizens who maintained human connections across battle lines when every system was designed to divide them. They embody the America we rebuild today. The government I lead will honor their sacrifice by ensuring such manipulation can never again succeed. Not through overreaching federal power, which proved vulnerable to capture, but through its opposite, a constitutional renewal that returns authority to states, communities, and citizens themselves. Our founders understood this wisdom. They created a republic where power was intentionally fragmented, divided between branches, distributed between levels, and ultimately residing with the people. In their caution about centralized authority lies our salvation. This isn't just about limiting government. It's about protecting democracy from any concentration of power, public or private, that threatens liberty. The constitutional amendments you ratified establish not just constraints on federal authority, but new safeguards against corporate control of essential functions. Never again will water, power, or communications be weaponized against Americans. Never again will private interests control the channels through which citizens receive vital information. Never again will we allow the tools of division to overwhelm our common bonds. I will not promise that the road ahead is easy. It is not. Infrastructure remains damaged, communities need healing, our economy requires rebuilding. These challenges demand not just government action, but renewed civic commitment, the active citizenship that has always been America's greatest strength. In recent months, we've witnessed that strength in extraordinary ways. When official systems failed, neighbors organized food distribution. When supply chains collapsed, communities created local solutions. When governance fractured, citizens built new frameworks from the ground up. This civic resilience, not any government program, represents our true national security. That's why our constitutional renewal emphasizes not just limiting federal power, but strengthening local authority. Not just constraining what government can do to you, but protecting what you can do for yourselves. Not just preventing the abuses of the past, but building capacity for the challenges of the future. Thomas Jefferson said the government closest to the people serves them best. George Washington warned against the spirit of party that divides citizens who share common interests. Benjamin Franklin, when asked what government the Constitutional Convention had created, famously replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Today, we begin again the work of keeping it. This work belongs not just to those in public office, but to every American. It requires not just new laws, but renewed commitment to the principles that unite us beyond any difference of opinion or background. It demands we remember that democracy isn't just something we have, it's something we do every day through the choices we make as citizens. Let us choose wisely. Let us choose to see our neighbors not through the lens of faction, but as fellow Americans with whom we share a common destiny. Let us choose to evaluate information not by whether it confirms our beliefs, but by whether it reflects reality. Let us choose to engage our differences not through demonization, but through the hard work of democratic deliberation. For in these choices lies the soul of our republic. Not just what we believe, but how we believe it. Not just the America we inherit, but the one we build together. Not just who we were, but who we choose to become. I stand here today humbled by your trust to lead a nation emerging from its darkest hour with newfound wisdom about democracy's fragility and strength. The light that guided us through that darkness wasn't some grand ideology or partisan vision. It was the simple, powerful recognition that beneath our manufactured differences, we remain one people with a shared stake in freedom. We were never two countries. We were one conversation, and we forgot how to listen. Today, we begin listening again. May God bless the work before us, and may God protect the United States of America.
That was President Titus Brasca delivering his inaugural address. The speech emphasized the constitutional reforms enacted during the transition period while focusing on the civic renewal already visible in communities across America. Brasca takes office with unprecedented cross-regional support, having won majorities in territories formerly aligned with all three factions. His cabinet, announced yesterday, includes experts from diverse backgrounds united by their commitment to decentralized governance and strong safeguards against both government overreach and corporate manipulation. For the Independent American Network, I'm Sarah Connor. My father often said that democracy requires not just votes, but vigilance, the constant attention of citizens to the institutions that serve them. As our nation begins this new chapter, that vigilance remains our most sacred responsibility. Stay free, stay united, stay American.
Good evening again. I trust you found our Chronicle illuminating. You've now witnessed the complete arc of America's fictional dissolution, from the assassination of Barrett Strife, through civil conflict, to the revelation of corporate orchestration. Our story concluded with an unexpected turn. The exposure of Shinra Corporation's Operation Permanent Majority triggered not just outrage, but recognition. Americans who had been manipulated into viewing each other as enemies suddenly recognized their common exploitation. Artificial divisions collapsed. A new republic emerged with safeguards against both governmental overreach and corporate manipulation. A tidy resolution for our fictional America. But the vulnerabilities exposed in our narrative deserve closer examination. They existed not in tanks or bombs, but in the infrastructure of information itself. Consider how our characters received entirely different versions of the same events. Federal citizens consuming narratives of terrorist insurrection, coalition supporters watching reports of tyrannical oppression, each side's perception managed by algorithms designed to maximize engagement rather than understanding. The most dangerous weapon was not artillery, but the deliberate fragmentation of shared reality. Perhaps most troubling is how even supposedly reputable sources proved unreliable. Corporate-owned journalists presented themselves as neutral arbiters while subtly advancing their owners' interests. Experts cited the same carefully curated statistics to support opposing conclusions. Even when citizens sought to diversify their information diet, they often encountered the illusion of variety, different logos and personalities delivering essentially identical narratives, all flowing from the same hidden source. The appearance of independent confirmation merely reinforced the deception. In our world, your world, these mechanisms already operate. Information systems increasingly curate reality, based not on accuracy, but on engagement metrics. Social media algorithms promote content that confirms existing beliefs. News sources chase audience loyalty over objective reporting. The walls between information ecosystems grow higher each day. When citizens receive information from only one source, or from multiple sources, all singing the same tune, democracy itself becomes vulnerable. Without exposure to diverse perspectives, we lose the friction that refines ideas. Without trusted neutral arbiters of fact, we lose the common ground necessary for productive disagreement. Without shared understanding of basic reality, we lose the foundation for collective decision-making. Without shared understanding of basic reality, we lose the foundation for collective decision-making. The most insidious aspect of information manipulation is that its victims believe themselves immune to it. Others may be manipulated, they think, but I see clearly. This confidence makes the manipulation all the more effective. Like the characters in our chronicle, we rarely recognize the architecture of our own perception until it collapses completely. I leave you with this observation. In our fictional America, salvation came not through victory of one faction over another, but through recognition of the forces operating beyond factional boundaries. It came when citizens breached the walls separating their information ecosystems and began comparing direct experiences rather than mediated narratives. It came ultimately through the painful discovery that what appeared as irreconcilable difference was largely manufactured division. As you return to your news feeds and social media streams, perhaps carry with you a question. What forces might be shaping not just what you believe, but how you believe it? What systems determine which information reaches you and which remains invisible? Whose interests are served by the boundaries between your information ecosystem and those of your fellow citizens? For now, our chronicle concludes. Whether its warnings prove prophetic or merely entertaining is, I suppose, up to you. Good night.